There's a vending machine at the end of my street that doesn't belong to anyone. It appeared one morning without warning, squatting on the cracked sidewalk like it had always been there. The metal was painted a dull red, chipped at the corners, and the glass display case was clouded with smudges. It looked like any other vending machine you'd see at a gas station or a school cafeteria, except for the fact that no one had ever seen it before. No delivery truck, no installation crew, nothing. Just the machine, sitting there at the edge of the street, humming softly like it had a purpose. At first, people ignored it. There are stranger things in this city than an unmarked vending machine. A few kids joked about it, shook it a little, but they gave up when nothing happened. The buttons were worn, but they didn't seem to do anything. The coin slot was jammed, and the keypad for entering selections was scratched to the point of being unreadable. Everyone assumed it was broken and moved on. Everyone except me. I passed it every day on my way to work, always giving it a cursory glance. It fascinated me, though I couldn't explain why. It just felt out of place, like it wasn't supposed to be there, and yet it was. I started noticing small details. The hum that grew louder when you got close, the faint scent of something sweet wafting from the machine, the way the glass reflected the streetlights at night, almost too brightly. One evening, curiosity got the better of me. It was late, and the street was empty, the city's usual noise muted by the fog rolling in off the bay. I stood in front of the vending machine, staring at the cloudy glass. The items inside weren't snacks or sodas, not even the weird energy drinks no one ever buys. They were strange. On the top row was a small jar filled with something black and swirling, like ink caught in motion. Next to it, a key, rusted and ornate, with a bow shaped like a crescent moon. The middle rows held an assortment of objects. A folded piece of yellowed paper, a single black feather, what looked like a pair of dice carved out of bone. The bottom row was almost empty, except for a small vial of something golden, glowing faintly even in the dim light. I couldn't see any prices. The keypad was unreadable, and the coin slot still looked jammed. But as I stood there, staring at the items, the hum grew louder. It wasn't a mechanical hum anymore. It had a rhythm to it, like a low, resonant pulse. It made my teeth ache, but I couldn't walk away. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a handful of loose change. Without thinking, I shoved a coin into the jammed slot. It shouldn't have gone in. It was completely blocked, but the coin slid through like water, disappearing into the machine with a soft clink. The hum stopped. For a moment, nothing happened. Then one of the buttons lit up, D4. I pressed it. The vial of golden liquid tumbled down into the slot at the bottom, landing with a soft clink. I reached in and picked it up, the glass cool and smooth against my skin. Up close, the liquid seemed alive, swirling and shimmering as if it were trying to escape the confines of the vial. I had no idea what to do with it. I thought about leaving it there, but something about it felt important, like it had been waiting for me. I slipped it into my pocket and walked home, the hum of the machine fading into the night behind me. I didn't sleep well that night. I dreamed of golden light spilling through cracks in the walls, of whispers threading through the air like smoke. When I woke up, the vial was still in my pocket, warm now, like it had been held in someone's hand. For the rest of the day, I couldn't focus. The vial felt heavy, even though it couldn't have weighed more than a few ounces. I kept checking my pocket, making sure it was still there, as if it might disappear the moment I looked away. That evening, I went back to the vending machine. It was still there, humming softly, the glass fogged with condensation. This time, someone had scratched a word into the metal casing just above the coin slot. Decide. The items inside were different now. The jar of black ink was gone, replaced by a silver locket. The bone dice were gone too, their spot now occupied by a red string, coiled tightly like a serpent. I didn't hesitate. I pulled out another coin, fed it into the slot, and waited. B2. I pressed the button. The red string fell into the slot, and when I picked it up, it felt heavier than it should have, like it was holding something I couldn't see. That's how it went for the next week. Every night, I'd visit the machine. Every night, I'd feed it a coin, and every night, it would give me something new. A shard of glass that glimmered like a star, a ring that fit perfectly on my finger, a small, folded map that led to nowhere I recognized. I didn't know why I kept going back. The items didn't make sense. They didn't do anything, at least not at first. But I couldn't stop. Then, last night, the machine gave me a card. It was old, the edges frayed, the surface faded. The front showed an illustration of a tower struck by lightning, its top crumbling into flames. The back was blank, except for a single word written in looping script, "Come." I didn't understand what it meant. I thought it was just another trinket, something to add to the growing pile on my desk. But when I looked up, the vending machine had changed. The glass wasn't fogged anymore. I could see through it clearly, and for the first time, I noticed my reflection in the glass. Except it wasn't me. The face staring back at me was almost mine, but not quite. The eyes were darker, the mouth slightly wider, the skin faintly gray. It tilted its head, studying me, and I felt something cold coil around my chest. Then it smiled. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen. When I finally looked away, the vending machine was gone. The sidewalk was empty, the space where it had been now just cracked concrete. I still have the card. It's sitting on my nightstand, the word "come" staring up at me. And I swear, sometimes, late at night, I can't hear the hum. The man in the yellow jacket first showed up on the third Wednesday of November. I only remember the date because I'd written it in the corner of the notebook I carry everywhere, the one I use for jotting down ideas or grocery lists or whatever random thought gets stuck in my head. I'd written November 15th, milk, rice, cat food in loopy, half-distracted handwriting, and I was walking home from the store, the plastic bag biting into my palm, when I noticed him. He was standing across the street, leaning against the lamp post, his hands in his pockets. The jacket he was wearing was an almost painful shade of yellow. Not golden, not mustard, but neon, the kind of yellow you could see from a mile away. It wasn't just the jacket that caught my eye, though. It was the way he was looking at me. Not casually, not like people do when they're glancing around and their eyes happen to land on you, but intently, like I was the only person in the world worth looking at. His face was blank, not smiling, not frowning, just neutral. I kept walking. People are weird sometimes. That's what I told myself, anyway. I crossed the street a block further down, glancing over my shoulder just once, and he was still there, his head tilted slightly to the side like he was trying to figure me out. When I got home, I told myself to forget about him. And I did, mostly. At least until I saw him again a week later, in the same spot. Same lamppost, same neon yellow jacket, same blank expression. This time, I stopped. I was about to call out, to ask if he needed something, or if he was lost. But as soon as I opened my mouth, he turned and walked away. Not hurriedly, not like he was trying to escape, but casually, like he'd just remembered he had somewhere else to be. I stood there for a while, watching him disappear around the corner. There was something about him I couldn't shake, something that stuck to me like a burr. He didn't look dangerous. If anything, he looked ordinary, average height, average build, clean-shaven, with short, dark hair peeking out from under the hood of his jacket. But the way he moved, the way he watched me, it felt purposeful, too purposeful. For the next few weeks, I kept an eye out for him. I started walking different routes home, changing up my schedule, taking detours through unfamiliar streets just to see if he'd show up somewhere else. But no matter where I went, he was there, always leaning against something. Lamp posts, mailboxes, even the side of a coffee shop once. Always wearing that same yellow jacket and always watching me with that same blank, unreadable face. I thought about confronting him, about asking him what he wanted, but there was something about him that made me hesitate. I didn't know why. I didn't feel scared, exactly, but the thought of speaking to him made my stomach twist in ways I couldn't explain. It wasn't until the first week of January that I noticed something had changed. He wasn't just watching me anymore. He was closer. The first time I realized it, I was unlocking the door to my apartment building. I felt a prickle on the back of my neck, the unmistakable sensation of being watched, and when I turned around, there he was. He wasn't across the street this time. He was standing on the sidewalk, maybe 15 feet away, his hands still in his pockets, his head tilted in that same curious way. "Can I help you?" I called out, my voice sharper than I intended. He didn't answer. He didn't move. He just stood there, watching me, and after a long moment, he turned and walked away like he always did. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out what he wanted, why he kept following me, why I couldn't bring myself to do anything about it. I thought about calling the police, but what would I even say? There's a man in a yellow jacket who keeps showing up wherever I go. He hasn't done anything. He hasn't said anything. He's just there. I didn't see him for a few days after that, and I started to think maybe he'd moved on, found someone else to follow. But then, one night, I saw him standing under the street lamp outside my apartment. He wasn't leaning against it this time. He was standing directly beneath it, his arms at his sides, the light casting long, sharp shadows across the sidewalk. He was staring up at my window. I froze. He couldn't see me, I told myself. My apartment was on the 3rd floor, my blinds half closed, the room dimly lit by the glow of the TV. But as I stood there, peeking through the gap in the blinds, his head tilted slightly to the side, like he knew I was there, like he was looking through the window, right at me. I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest. I thought about calling someone, anyone, but my phone was in the other room, and I didn't want to risk walking past the window again. When I finally worked up the courage to look, he was gone. The next day, I found something on my doorstep. It was a small, yellow envelope, the same shade as his jacket. There was no name, no address, no stamp, just a plain envelope, sealed with a strip of tape. I picked it up carefully, half expecting it to be empty, but inside was a single piece of paper, folded into quarters. When I unfolded it, my stomach dropped. It was a picture of me, not a recent picture. It looked old, like it had been taken years ago. In the photo, I was sitting in the park, smiling at something just out of frame. I didn't recognize the moment. I didn't even remember owning the clothes I was wearing in the picture. But that wasn't the worst part. In the background, barely visible among the trees, was the man in the yellow jacket. I don't know how long I stared at that photo, my hands trembling, my mind racing. He'd been following me for longer than I realized. Years, maybe, decades. I don't see him anymore. Not in the streets, not under the street lamp, not across the way. But sometimes, when I'm walking home or sitting alone in my apartment, I feel it, that prickle on the back of my neck, that heavy, watchful presence just out of sight. And every now and then, I find another envelope, always yellow, always empty. You ever feel like someone's watching you? Not because they're curious, or because they mean you harm, but because they've been watching you for so long they don't know how to stop? The mailbox appeared on a Wednesday. I know it was Wednesday because that's the day I always take the trash out, and it definitely wasn't there the day before. It was sitting at the very edge of my lawn, planted firmly in the dirt like it had grown there overnight. A plain black mailbox on a crooked wooden post. No numbers, no name, just a little red flag sticking up like it had something important to say. I stood there for a good 5 minutes, trying to make sense of it. I live on the end of a dead-end street, surrounded by woods, with no neighbors in sight. The only mailbox on my property was supposed to be the rusty one at the end of my driveway. This one didn't make any sense. I even checked the ground around it to see if someone had dug it up and replanted it as a prank, but the dirt looked untouched, as if it had always been there. I probably should have just left it alone, but there was something about it that made me curious. Maybe it was the way the paint looked so fresh, or the fact that the little flag was raised like it was daring me to look inside. Whatever the reason, I found myself opening it before I even realized what I was doing. Inside was a single envelope, creamy white with no address or stamp. My name was written across the front in neat, looping cursive, Evan. I hesitated, glancing around the yard as if someone might be watching me, then pulled the envelope out and opened it. Inside was a folded piece of paper, also blank except for a single sentence written in the same elegant handwriting. "Your dog is alive." I read the sentence 3 times before the words started to make sense. My dog, Riley, had been dead for almost 6 months. He was a big golden retriever, old and gentle, and he'd passed away peacefully in his sleep one night. I'd buried him under the oak tree in the backyard, wrapped in his favorite blanket. The note didn't make any sense. It had to be a joke, though I couldn't imagine who would think that was funny. I crumpled up the note, tossed it in the trash can with the rest of the garbage, and went back inside. The next morning, the mailbox was still there. The flag was down this time, and when I opened it, there was nothing inside. I told myself it wasn't a big deal, just a weird prank, maybe a kid messing around. But all day, I couldn't stop thinking about the note. That night, just as I was getting ready for bed, I heard it. A bark. It was faint, muffled by the walls of the house. But it was definitely a bark. My heart stopped. I stood there in the middle of my bedroom, listening. A few seconds later, it came again. I grabbed a flashlight and went outside, barefoot and still in my pajamas. The air was cold, and the yard was empty, but the sound was unmistakable. Riley's bark. I called his name, my voice trembling. Riley? There was no answer, just the rustling of the trees and the distant chirping of crickets. I spent the next half hour searching the yard, shining my flashlight into every corner, even checking under the oak tree where I'd buried him. The dirt was undisturbed, the grave intact. When I finally went back inside, I told myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I wasn't sure I believed that. The next morning, there was another note in the mailbox. Follow him. That was all it said. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to just rip the mailbox out of the ground and be done with it, but another part of me, a part one didn't want to admit existed, was curious. What if it wasn't a joke? What if there was something I didn't understand? That night, I heard the bark again. This time, it was louder, closer, and when I looked out the window, I saw him. Riley. He was standing in the yard, his golden fur glowing faintly in the moonlight. He looked exactly as I remembered him, except for his eyes. They were brighter, sharper, almost too vivid, like someone had turned up the saturation on a photograph. I threw open the door and ran outside, calling his name. He wagged his tail and took a step toward me, then stopped. He barked once, then turned and started walking toward the woods. Riley! I shouted, but he didn't stop. I hesitated for only a moment before I followed him. The woods behind my house were dense and dark, the kind of place where the trees seemed to press in around you. I could barely see where I was going, but Riley moved with purpose, weaving through the underbrush like he knew exactly where he was headed. We walked for what felt like hours, though it was probably only 20 minutes. Then, suddenly, he stopped. We were in a clearing, the ground soft and covered in moss. In the center of the clearing was a small wooden box, no bigger than a shoebox. Riley sat down next to it and looked up at me, his tail wagging slowly. I knelt down and opened the box. Inside was a collar. Riley's collar. The one he'd been wearing when I buried him. My hands were shaking as I picked it up. It was clean, unmarked, as if it had never been underground. I looked at Riley, but he was gone. I spent the next few days trying to make sense of what had happened. The mailbox was still there, but it was empty, and I didn't hear Riley's bark again. I couldn't bring myself to throw the collar away, so I put it in my desk drawer and tried to move on. Weeks passed, then months. Eventually, the strangeness of that night faded into the background, replaced by the steady hum of everyday life. I stopped checking the mailbox, stopped thinking about the clearing in the woods. But sometimes, late at night, I'd dream about Riley. He'd be standing at the edge of the woods, his golden fur glowing, his eyes bright and vivid. He never barked, never moved, just stood there, watching me. And then one morning, almost a year after it all began, I woke up to find the mailbox gone. No hole in the ground, no trace it had ever been there. Just an empty patch of grass where it used to stand. And on the porch, resting neatly on the welcome mat, was Riley's collar. I don't know what it means. I don't think I ever will. But every now and then, when the wind rustles through the trees just right, I hear a faint, familiar bark, and I like to think he's still out there, waiting for me to follow. The sound of the key turning in the lock wasn't loud, but it felt intrusive in the quiet of the old house. I hadn't used the key in years, hadn't even known I still had it until I'd found it in a box of mismatched socks and forgotten mementos. It was heavier than I remembered. The iron worn smooth in places where my fingers had once gripped it often. My hand hesitated on the doorknob, as if some part of me knew that once I opened this door, the weight of what lay behind it would follow me back out. The house was exactly as I'd left it. Dust coated every surface, softening the edges of furniture that hadn't been moved in over a decade. The air carried that peculiar smell of abandonment, damp wood, old fabric, and the faint, lingering trace of lives once lived here. My footsteps echoed, a hollow sound in the cavernous silence, as I walked through the rooms, each one a snapshot of a life interrupted. In the living room, the clock on the mantel had stopped at 2:17. It had always stopped at 2:17, no matter how often we wound it. My mother used to laugh about it, saying the house had its own ideas about time. She stopped laughing after the night my father disappeared. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the clock, before turning toward the stairs. The wooden steps groaned under my weight, protesting my presence like an old wound being reopened. Each step carried me closer to the attic, a place I hadn't dared visit since the night we found the door. I'd been 13 then, too young to understand what we'd done by opening it. The attic door was ajar, just as we'd left it. I could see the faint outline of the trapdoor set into the floorboards, its edges marked by faint scorch marks that no amount of scrubbing had ever removed. My breath caught in my throat as I stepped inside, the memories rushing back with the force of a tide. The whispers that came from nowhere, the way the air had turned thick and cold, the pull of something unseen yet undeniable. The trapdoor was smaller than I remembered. Its hinges rusted, the wood warped slightly with age. I crouched down and placed my hand on it, the rough grain of the wood biting into my palm. For a moment, I considered walking away, leaving it untouched. But then I heard it, a faint scratching sound, like fingernails on glass, coming from beneath the floor. My pulse quickened as I pried the trapdoor open. The hinges screeched, the sound reverberating through the attic like a warning. Beneath the door was a set of stairs, descending into darkness. I couldn't remember if those stairs had always been there, and something about that realization made my skin crawl. The flashlight in my pocket flickered to life, its beam cutting through the shadows as I began my descent. The air grew colder with each step, heavy with the scent of damp earth and something metallic. The walls were close, rough-hewn stone pressing in on either side, and I could feel the weight of the house above me, a looming presence that seemed to hold its breath. At the bottom of the stairs was a room, circular and impossibly large, its walls covered in strange symbols etched into the stone. In the center of the room stood a table, and on that table was a mirror. It wasn't like any mirror I'd ever seen. The glass was dark, almost black, and its surface seemed to ripple faintly, as though it were alive. I approached it slowly, the beam of my flashlight flickering and dimming the closer I got. The air around the mirror felt different, heavier, as though it were charged with static. I reached out, my fingers hovering just above the surface, and then I froze. The reflection wasn't mine. The face staring back at me was similar, but not the same. The features were sharper, the eyes darker, and the expression held something I couldn't quite name. Curiosity, amusement, or maybe hunger. It tilted its head, mirroring my movements, and then its mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear. I stepped back, my heart pounding. The figure in the mirror didn't move. It remained still, watching, waiting. I turned away, intending to leave, but the symbols on the walls seemed to pulse, glowing faintly with a light that didn't come from my flashlight. The air grew colder, and the scratching sound began again, louder this time, echoing all around me. I didn't realize the trapdoor had closed until I tried to climb the stairs. My hands scrabbled against the rough wood, but it wouldn't budge. The scratching grew louder, joined now by a low, guttural hum that seemed to vibrate through the stone walls. I turned back toward the mirror, and the figure was gone. The glass was empty, reflecting only the dark room behind me. And then I felt it, a hand, cold and solid, gripping my shoulder. I spun around, but there was nothing there, only the faintest outline of a figure fading into the shadows. When I looked back at the mirror, the figure had returned. It smiled this time, its teeth sharp and glinting, and then it lifted a hand and pointed at the symbols on the wall. My flashlight flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. The scratching stopped, replaced by a silence so profound it felt alive. I don't know how I got out. The next thing I remember, I was standing outside the house, the key still in my hand, The front door locked and silent behind me. The sun was rising, its light washing over the cracked pavement and empty streets, and the weight in my chest began to ease. But as I turned to leave, I felt the cold presence again, just for a moment, like a breath on the back of my neck. The mirror is gone now, but sometimes I see it in my dreams. Or maybe it's not a dream. Maybe it's waiting, still watching, still curious. And maybe, just maybe, it's still hungry. I didn't expect to find the door in the alley. I wasn't looking for it. I was just taking a shortcut I'd walked a dozen times before, cutting through the narrow passage between the old hardware store and the laundromat that always smelled faintly of burnt fabric softener. The walls on either side were streaked with grime, the pavement littered with broken glass and faded flyers for garage bands I'd never heard of. It was a forgettable place, a space that only existed to get me from one side of the block to the other. But that day, the door was there. It didn't make sense. The alley was narrow, too narrow for a door to exist where it did, nestled in the wall like it had always been there. I almost didn't notice it at first, just a dull rectangle in the shadows. But something about the way the light hit it made me stop. The door wasn't remarkable. It was painted a chipped, peeling green, the kind of color that reminded me of old park benches. The brass handle was tarnished, flecked with rust, and there was no sign, no address, no indication of what might be behind it. I stood there, staring at it, a strange unease curling in my stomach. This wasn't the kind of alley that hid charming cafes or secret speakeasies. It was the kind of alley where you kept your head down and walked quickly, but something about the door tugged at me. It wasn't fear. It was curiosity, sharp and relentless, like the kind I'd felt as a kid whenever I found a locked drawer or a box I wasn't supposed to open. I glanced around, half expecting someone to yell at me, to tell me the door wasn't mine to touch. But the alley was empty, just the faint hum of the laundromat's dryers breaking the silence. Slowly, I reached for the handle. It was cold under my fingers, colder than it should have been, and as I turned it, the door swung open with a groan that echoed down the alley. What I saw inside didn't make sense. It wasn't another room. It wasn't storage or a stairwell or any of the things my brain tried to conjure to make sense of it. It was a field, a vast, open field stretching out in every direction, the kind of endless green that made you feel small just looking at it. The sky above it was a deep, impossible shade of blue, dotted with clouds that looked like they'd been painted by someone with too much time on their hands. The air that spilled out through the doorway smelled like spring, like grass after rain, like warm earth, like something alive. I stepped through without thinking, the door clicking shut behind me. The ground beneath my feet was soft, the kind of soft that made me want to kick off my shoes and let my toes sink into it. I turned around, half expecting the door to be gone, but it was still there, standing alone in the field, looking even more out of place than it had in the alley. The handle gleamed faintly in the sunlight, but I didn't reach for it. Not yet. Ahead of me, the field rolled gently, small hills rising and falling like waves frozen in place. And in the distance, far enough that I couldn't tell if I was imagining it, there was something moving, a shape, faint and shifting, like a figure walking but not quite. I started walking toward it, my steps slow and hesitant. The air was warm, but not oppressively so, and the grass whispered faintly as I moved through it. The closer I got to the figure, the stranger it became. It didn't move like a person. It flickered, almost like it was caught between one place and another. When I finally reached it, I stopped. It wasn't a person, or maybe it was, but not entirely. The shape was human, 2 arms, 2 legs, a head, but the edges were blurred, like someone had taken an eraser to its outline. Its surface shimmered faintly, not metallic exactly, but not solid either. It felt like looking at a reflection in a puddle, the way it wavered and shifted with each breath I took. It didn't speak, but I felt something. An invitation, maybe, or a question. The kind of thing you don't hear with your ears, but with something deeper, something you can't explain. "What is this place?" I asked, my voice sounding small and strange in the open air. The figure didn't answer, but the air around it seemed to hum, a low vibration that settled in my chest. I took a step closer, and for a moment, I thought it might reach out to me. But then it moved away, gliding effortlessly across the field, its shape growing smaller and smaller until it vanished into the horizon. I stood there for a long time, staring at the place where it had disappeared. The field was quiet now, the only sound the rustle of grass in the breeze. Eventually, I turned back toward the door. It looked farther away than it had before, but I knew it hadn't moved. My legs felt heavy as I walked, the weight of what I'd seen pressing down on me. When I reached the door, I hesitated. I didn't want to leave, not yet, but the air had shifted, colder now, and the field didn't feel quite as inviting as it had before. I stepped through the doorway, back into the alley. The smells of the city hit me immediately. Oil, garbage, something sharp and metallic. I turned to look at the door, but it was gone. The wall where it had been was smooth, unbroken, as if it had never been there. I walked home in a daze, the sounds of the city fading into the background. That night, I dreamed of the field, of the way the grass had felt under my feet, of the figures' blurred edges and the hum in the air. When I woke, I half expected the smell of spring to linger, but it was gone, replaced by the stale scent of my apartment. I went back to the alley the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that. The door never reappeared, no matter how long I waited. But sometimes, when I'm walking alone and the light hits just right, I think I can feel it. The faint hum, the pull of something vast and impossible waiting just out of sight. I've been getting anonymous postcards in the mail for the past 7 months. They arrive like clockwork, one every Thursday, without a return address, postmarked from places I've never been. The first one came from a small town in Maine I had to Google to confirm it even existed. The front showed a lighthouse, its white and red tower piercing through a thick coastal fog. On the back, in neat, looping handwriting, was a single sentence. Do you ever feel like you were meant to live by the sea? No name, no explanation, just that question. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Maybe someone had the wrong address or was trying to reconnect with an old friend who didn't live here anymore. But the second card arrived the following week. This one was from somewhere in the Midwest, a photograph of a golden cornfield stretching endlessly under a cobalt sky. On the back, the same handwriting. If you were a color, what would you be? I didn't know how to respond to that question, or if I even should. I hadn't told anyone about the first postcard because it seemed so inconsequential, like some odd hiccup in the postal system that would sort itself out. But 2 weeks in a row, it felt deliberate. I stared at the second card for hours, running my fingers over the textured paper, wondering who would send something like this. There were no clues in the handwriting, no flair or personal touch that I could tie to anyone I knew. Just clean, even letters that looked more practiced than natural. I debated asking my neighbors, but what would I even say? Hey, did you accidentally send me a cryptic postcard about colors from Kansas? No, it was ridiculous. By the time the third postcard arrived, I'd accepted that whoever was sending them knew exactly what they were doing. This one came from a tiny island off the coast of Washington State, the kind of place that sounded like it belonged in a novel instead of real life. The front showed a rocky beach at sunset, the sky streaked with oranges and pinks that looked too vivid to be real. On the back, when was the last time you felt completely weightless? The questions got to me. They weren't casual, forgettable things. They stuck, burrowed into my mind like seeds, and before I knew it, I was spending more time thinking about them than I cared to admit. Was I meant to live by the sea? What color would I be? When had I last felt weightless? They weren't questions I would have asked myself, not in the middle of my routine, not when I was too busy worrying about grocery lists and utility bills and whether my boss thought I was competent enough for a promotion. But now, they were there, planted in my head, and they refused to leave. By the fourth postcard, I'd started to look forward to Thursdays in a way I hadn't since I was a kid waiting for the next episode of my favorite cartoon. Each week, a new card arrived, each one from a different corner of the country. A desert in Arizona, a misty Appalachian forest, a snowy Alaskan fishing village. The fronts were always striking, the kinds of images that made you feel like you were looking at someone else's life, someone who knew how to be in the world in a way you didn't. And the questions, they got more personal, more pointed. What's the last thing you said out loud to yourself when no one was listening? If you disappeared tomorrow, would people remember about you? Have you ever lied to someone you love? And if so, did it feel like drowning? I didn't know what to do with these questions. I didn't have answers for most of them, and even the ones I thought I could answer felt slippery, like trying to hold water in my hands. Still, I kept every card. I lined them up on my kitchen counter at first, but when they started taking up too much space, I taped them to the wall by my desk. By the time the 12th postcard arrived, my wall looked like a map of someone else's adventures, a journey I wasn't part of but couldn't stop following. I started imagining the person behind them. I pictured someone sitting at a wooden desk, an open map spread out before them, their finger tracing the next destination with a kind of restless certainty. I imagined them writing the postcards late at night, the sound of waves or crickets or wind outside their window, their pen moving deliberately across the back of each card. Sometimes I thought they were someone I used to know, a forgotten friend or an ex who wanted me to think about them without saying so directly. Other times, I imagined they were a stranger, someone who'd picked me at random, my name plucked from a phone book or found scribbled on a scrap of paper in a library. I didn't know which possibility unnerved me more. And then, one Thursday, the postcards stopped. I waited all day, checking the mailbox twice, then 3 times, as though my persistence might summon one. But there was nothing. No lighthouse, no cornfield, no snow-covered village. Just bills, junk mail, and the sinking realization that whoever had been sending them was finished. I stared at my wall of postcards that night, the questions staring back at me like unblinking eyes, and I felt a strange sense of loss. It wasn't the cards themselves I missed. It was the connection, the sense that someone, somewhere, was thinking of me enough to send them. Without them, my life felt quieter, duller. The next week came and went without a postcard. Then another, and another. By the time a month had passed, I'd resigned myself to the idea that the mystery would remain unsolved. I'd never know who sent them or why. It was strange, but I could live with it. After all, nothing in life promised closure. And then, last night, there was a knock on my door. It was late, too late for visitors, and for a moment, I considered ignoring it. But something pulled me toward the door, a thread of curiosity I couldn't ignore. When I opened it, there was no one there. Just an envelope on the doormat, thick and heavy, with my name written on the front in the same looping handwriting as the postcards. My hands trembled as I picked it up, as I tore it open and pulled out the folded pages inside. It wasn't a letter. It was a list. A list of all the questions from the postcards, each one typed in bold black ink, followed by blank spaces where the answers should go. At the bottom of the last page, in handwriting that felt both familiar and strange, was one final question. What will you do now that you have all the time in the world to think? I sat on the floor of my apartment, the list spread out before me, and for the first time in months, I didn't look for an answer. I just let the silence settle around me, waiting to see what might emerge. The package arrived on my desk at work, wrapped in plain brown paper tied with twine. There was no postage stamp, no return address, no delivery receipt. Just my name written in red ink on the top, in a handwriting so precise it felt surgical. It sat there, radiating a quiet kind of weight, like it knew I'd be reluctant to touch it. My office was small, the kind of space no one really notices, tucked in the back corner of a soulless building downtown. No one could have gotten in without passing through security. Yet here it was, waiting for me. I stared at it for a long time, trying to recall if I'd ordered something late at night and forgotten about it. My inbox was empty. No mysterious emails, no weird Amazon orders. My phone didn't show any texts or notifications. When I finally reached out to pick it up, it was heavier than I expected, dense and solid, with the faint smell of something metallic, like old coins. For reasons I couldn't explain, I didn't open it at work. Instead, I tucked it under my arm and carried it out with me when I left, ignoring the odd glance from my coworker near the elevator. I wanted to open it somewhere that felt less exposed, less sterile. On the drive home, it sat on the passenger seat, and even though it didn't move or make a sound, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me. By the time I reached my apartment, my curiosity had transformed into unease, but I couldn't leave it alone. I set it down on my kitchen counter, pulled the blinds shut, and cut the twine with a pair of scissors. The paper unfolded easily, soft and worn, and inside was a black wooden box with no seams or hinges. It was perfectly smooth, the surface polished to a dull sheen that caught the dim light. There was no visible way to open it. No latch, no crack, no keyhole. Just a single engraved symbol on the top, a circle with a jagged line cutting through it. I turned it over in my hands, searching for something I'd missed. The weight of it felt oddly balanced, as though there was something heavy inside, but perfectly positioned so the box wouldn't tip or wobble. I tapped it lightly with my knuckles, and the sound that came back was wrong. Hollow, but not in the way you'd expect from an empty container. It felt like the sound curved inward, twisting and folding in on itself before fading. I whispered to no one, "What the hell is this?" The second I spoke, the box grew warm in my hands. Not hot, but distinctly warm, like it had absorbed body heat in an instant. I dropped it on the counter, my pulse spiking, and stared as it pulsed faintly, as if a heartbeat was coming from deep inside it. And then the cracks appeared. Thin, glowing lines began to spiderweb across the surface, illuminating the dark wood with a soft white light. I took a step back, my breath catching, but the box didn't break apart. Instead, the cracks formed an intricate pattern, something that looked almost like a map, though I couldn't make sense of it. The glow wasn't harsh, it was gentle, inviting even, but it felt alive. That same wrong, twisting sound filled the room again, but this time it wasn't fading. It was building. A whisper came from nowhere. It wasn't a voice exactly, more like the impression of words forming inside my skull, pushing through thoughts that weren't mine. "Are you ready?" The question hung there, not waiting for an answer, as the box split open with a sudden, fluid motion. It didn't crack or fall apart. It unfolded, like petals of a flower peeling back. Inside was nothing, just a hollow void that shouldn't have been possible. I leaned closer, hesitantly, and saw that the emptiness wasn't empty at all. It was moving, swirling, like a black current in the deepest part of the ocean. And then the room disappeared. I wasn't standing in my kitchen anymore. I wasn't standing at all. I was suspended in something that felt like space but wasn't. It was too dense, too full of motion. Stars that weren't stars spun in every direction, their light bending and stretching as if they were being pulled apart by invisible threads. The air, if you could call it that, was warm and heavy, humming with an energy that made my skin prickle. I tried to move, to speak, to scream, but my body wasn't mine. I was frozen in place, weightless, while the world, or whatever I was in, shifted around me. Then, far ahead, something moved. It wasn't human. It wasn't even remotely alive in the way we understand life. A shape, vast and formless, uncoiled itself in the distance, its edges shimmering with the same faint glow that had come from the box. It didn't have a face, but I felt its attention turned toward me. Not like being watched, being grasped. Held in its gaze, completely and utterly. The whispers returned, louder now, overlapping like a chorus of voices just out of reach. The same question repeated, not in English but in something deeper, older, a language I didn't understand but somehow knew. "Are you ready?" The thing began to move closer, its form shifting and expanding as it approached, filling my vision until it was all I could see. My chest felt tight, like I couldn't breathe, though I wasn't sure I needed to. The whispers grew louder, insistent, demanding. "Are you ready?" I didn't know what it wanted, but I felt an answer rise in me, unbidden. It wasn't a yes or no. It was something more primal, a recognition, a submission. And as soon as the answer formed in my mind, the thing stopped. The light around it flared, blinding and cold, and the world collapsed inward. I woke up on my kitchen floor, the wooden box sitting beside me, closed and whole again, as if it had never opened. My hands were trembling, my shirt damp with sweat, but I was alive. The box was cold now, its surface completely smooth, the glowing cracks and strange warmth gone. I wanted to throw it away, to burn it, to bury it somewhere no one would ever find it. But I couldn't. Something in me wouldn't let me. The box sits on my shelf now, unopened, untouched, but I can feel it watching me. And at night, when the world is quiet, I hear the whisper again, faint but growing louder. "Are you ready?" I was walking home from work when I saw it. a single white feather stuck in the chain-link fence of the old baseball field. It shouldn't have caught my attention. Feathers are everywhere, on sidewalks, stuck to car windshields, drifting in gutters. But something about this one stopped me. It wasn't big or particularly beautiful. The edges were frayed, the white dulled to a faint gray. But the way it clung to the fence, shivering lightly in the breeze, made it seem oddly alive, like it was waiting for someone to notice. I stood there, watching it, the low hum of traffic fading into the background. There was something familiar about the sight of it, though I couldn't place why. And then, like a match catching flame, the memory came back. I was 8, maybe 9, the kind of age where magic still feels possible, even if you don't quite believe in it anymore. My mom had taken me to visit her parents, who lived out in the countryside, in a house that seemed too big for just the two of them. Their backyard opened into a meadow, wild and sprawling. The kind of place that felt endless to a kid who'd spent most of her life in a cramped apartment. That day, I'd gone out to explore on my own, armed with a peanut butter sandwich wrapped in a napkin and a determination to prove to myself that I was brave enough to go all the way to the tree line. The meadow was loud with the hum of insects, the occasional bird slicing through the air above me. I was halfway across when I found it, a bird's wing, lying in the grass like it had fallen from the sky. It wasn't attached to a bird, just the wing itself, and at first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. The feathers were glossy and dark, almost black but shimmering blue in the sunlight. I poked it with a stick, half expecting it to move, but it didn't. It just lay there, still and strange, as if it had landed in the wrong world. I don't know how long I stared at it, but eventually I picked it up, cradling it in both hands as I ran back to the house. My mom was in the kitchen, talking to my grandmother. I remember bursting in, out of breath and wild-eyed, holding the wing out in front of me like I just discovered buried treasure. "Look what I found!" I shouted, waiting for them to be as amazed as I was. My mom frowned, wiping her hands on a dish towel, and told me to take it outside. "It's dirty," she said. My grandmother, though, leaned closer, squinting at it with a strange expression I couldn't place. She asked where I'd found it, and when I told her, she nodded slowly, like she understood something I didn't. Later that evening, after my mom had gone to bed, my grandmother found me in the living room. She sat down beside me, holding a shoebox lined with an old dishcloth. "For the wing," she said simply, handing it to me. I didn't know what to say. I wasn't used to adults indulging my fascination with strange things. Together, we placed the wing gently inside the box, and she told me to keep it in the garage so the house wouldn't smell like death. But before she left, she said something I've never forgotten. Sometimes things fall so we can notice them. The next day, the wing was gone. I'd gone to check on it after breakfast, but the shoebox was empty, the dishcloth undisturbed. My mom said an animal probably dragged it off, and she was glad it was gone. "That thing was disgusting," she said, wrinkling her nose. But my grandmother didn't say anything. She just looked at me with a small, secret smile that made me wonder if she knew something I didn't. The memory faded as quickly as it came, leaving me standing there in front of the fence, the feather trembling in the wind. I reached out and plucked it from the chain link, turning it over in my hand. It was soft and brittle, like it might dissolve if I held it too tightly. For a moment, I considered tucking it into my pocket, taking it home like I had with the wing all those years ago. But instead, I just held it, staring at it as the memory played itself out again in my mind. I thought about my grandmother, how I hadn't thought of her in months. She'd passed away years ago, quietly, without fanfare, just the way she lived her life. I thought about the shoebox and the strange reverence with which she'd helped me place the wing inside it, like she understood why it mattered even though she didn't need to say it out loud. I thought about the way she used to hum while she cooked, the way she always seemed to know when I was about to cry before I even realized it myself. The feather felt heavier now, as though it carried the weight of all those moments I'd forgotten. I didn't know what to do with it. Part of me wanted to keep it, to find another shoebox, to preserve it as a reminder of something I couldn't quite name. But another part of me, the part that still believed, faintly, in the kind of magic I'd felt in that meadow, wanted to let it go, to leave it where someone else might find it. Maybe they'd pick it up, and it would mean nothing to them. Or maybe, just maybe, it would remind them of something they'd forgotten. I walked to the edge of the field, where a cluster of wildflowers leaned toward the fence, their petals already wilting in the cool air. I tucked the feather gently into the grass, propping it up so it stood like a tiny monument. Then I stepped back, brushing my hands against my coat, and stared at it for a moment longer before turning to leave. As I walked home, I felt lighter somehow, as if I'd left more than just the feather behind. My mind wandered to other forgotten things, scraps of memories buried under years of routine, little treasures I hadn't bothered to notice in too long. I thought about calling my mom, asking her if she remembered that summer at my grandparents' house, if she'd ever wondered what had happened to the wing. I thought about asking her if she'd ever found something that felt like it had fallen, just so she could notice it. The feather probably blew away before anyone else saw it. Maybe it got caught in another fence, or maybe it was swept up into the sky again, carried by a wind stronger than the one that had left it in my path. But that didn't matter. What mattered was the pause, the noticing, the memory it had brought back to me. Sometimes, things fall not to be kept, but simply to remind us to look. The market appeared on the last Thursday of every month, and only at night. There were no advertisements, no signs to guide you, just word-of-mouth whispers passed between those who claimed to have seen it. To find it, you needed to follow the flicker of lanterns through the old quarry road, past the ruins of the ironworks, until you reached the clearing. By then, the air would smell faintly of smoke and spices, and the hum of voices would grow louder, layered with notes from instruments that didn't quite sound human. Mira had heard the rumors for years, but never dared to go. People who talked about the market always spoke in fragments. A man selling stars trapped in jars, a woman offering truths too sharp to swallow, a stall where you could trade your shadow for a secret. It sounded like a fairy tale, or a warning. But tonight, Mira didn't hesitate. She couldn't afford to. The clearing was alive with light and movement, a tapestry of glowing tints and swaying figures. The stalls were mismatched, some made of wood and others of fabric or bones or materials Mira couldn't name. Creatures with too many limbs, or not enough moved through the crowd alongside humans, their voices blending into a language without words. Mira clutched the slip of paper in her hand, the edges damp with sweat, and scanned the market. The note had been left in her mailbox this morning, scrawled in a looping script she didn't recognize. Find the stall with the blue lantern. Bring your most precious possession. She didn't know who had sent it, but she knew why. Her brother, Tomas, had been missing for 3 weeks. The police had found his car abandoned on the highway, the driver's door open, his phone left on the passenger seat. No sign of a struggle, no explanation, just absence. Mira had searched everywhere, knocked on every door, called every hospital and shelter in the city. The note was her only lead, and the market her last hope. The blue lantern wasn't hard to find. It swung gently from the top of a stall made of dark wood, its light casting rippling shadows that seemed to move independently of the crowd. The vendor stood behind the counter, a tall figure wrapped in a cloak of shifting colors, their face hidden by a veil. The air around them was heavy with the scent of ozone and lavender. "You've come," the vendor said, their voice soft but resonant. Mira placed the slip of paper on the counter. "You left this in my mailbox." The vendor tilted their head, the veil rippling slightly. "You're searching for someone?" "Yes." Her voice cracked. "My brother." The vendor reached beneath the counter and placed a small box in front of her. It was plain, made of unvarnished wood, and unremarkable except for the intricate lock that held it shut. "This box contains the way to find him." Myra's breath caught. "What do you mean? What's inside?" "That depends on you," the vendor replied. "The box opens only when it is paid for." "What have you brought?" She hesitated, then pulled a necklace from her pocket and set it on the counter. The pendant was a small silver compass, its edges worn smooth. It had belonged to her mother, one of the few things she had left after the accident. "This is the most precious thing I own." The vendor reached out, their gloved hand brushing the necklace. "Memories carry weight," they said, "but this is not enough." Myra's chest tightened. "It's all I have." "No," the vendor said. "It isn't." The words hit her like a blow, and she realized what they meant. She glanced down at her shadow, stretched long and thin under the glow of the lantern. The vendor followed her gaze. "Your shadow is tied to you," they said. "It knows where you have been and where you will go. That is the price." Myra's hands clenched into fists. "If I give it to you, will I still find him?" "The box will show you the way," the vendor replied. "The choice is yours." She looked at the necklace, then at the vendor's veiled face, searching for any sign of deception. There was none. Slowly, she nodded. "Take it." The vendor raised their hand, and the lantern's light flared. Mira felt a strange pull, like a thread being unraveled from the fabric of her skin. Her shadow writhed, stretching and twisting before detaching completely. It floated toward the vendor, curling around their hand like smoke. Mira stumbled, her body suddenly lighter, unmoored. "It is done," the vendor said, sliding the box across the counter. Mira picked it up, the wood smooth and cool against her palms. The lock clicked open as if responding to her touch. She hesitated, then lifted the lid. Inside was a map. It was old and weathered, the edges frayed, but the lines were sharp and clear. It showed a place she didn't recognize, marked with symbols she couldn't decipher. At the center of the map was a single word written in bold, black ink: Eterna. "What is this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "The path," the vendor said. "Follow it, and you will find what you seek." She clutched the map tightly and turned to leave, but as she stepped away, the crowd seemed to shift. The lights dimmed, the colors bleeding into one another until the stalls blurred and the figures dissolved into shadows. The market was gone. Mira stood alone at the edge of the clearing, the map in her hand and the forest at her back. The road stretched ahead, unfamiliar but undeniable. She looked down at her feet, where her shadow had once followed her, and felt its absence like a phantom limb. She started walking. I was at the public library, sitting at one of those oversized wooden tables that smell faintly of varnish and old paper. I wasn't there for any particular reason, just killing time between errands, pretending I had some grand intellectual pursuit. The truth was, I liked the quiet, the kind of quiet you only find in libraries, where even whispers feel too loud, and the muffled sound of a turning page feels sacred. The table was almost empty except for me and an older woman at the far end, her gray hair tied back in a loose bun. She was wearing one of those oversized knitted sweaters that look like they weigh more than the person inside them. She had stacks of books in front of her, most of them thick and ancient-looking, the kind of books that seem more like relics than reading material. She didn't glance at me once, but I noticed her. It was hard not to. There was something about the way she moved, deliberate, methodical, as if she weren't reading the books but performing some private ritual with them. I told myself to mind my own business. I was here to enjoy the silence, not to invent stories about strangers. But just as I was about to turn back to my own book, a paperback thriller I'd half forgotten picking up, I heard a noise, a faint scratching, like nails on wood. It was coming from her end of the table. I glanced up, but she didn't seem to notice. She was flipping through one of the books now, her fingers moving quickly over the brittle pages. The scratching sound grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't a natural sound. It wasn't paper or wood, or the subtle groan of the building settling into itself. It sounded like something alive. The woman stopped flipping pages and froze. Her head tilted slightly, just enough for me to see her eyes shift toward me without fully turning. "You hear it, don't you?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I froze, unsure how to respond. My first instinct was to play dumb, to pretend I hadn't heard anything at all. But her gaze pinned me in place, sharp and knowing, like she already knew the answer. I nodded. She closed the book she was holding with a deliberate snap, then placed it gently on the table. Without saying another word, she stood up, gathered her books into a neat pile, and left the room. The scratching sound followed her as she walked away. I sat there for a while, my heart pounding, waiting for the noise to stop. But it didn't. It lingered, faint but steady, like it was waiting for something. I looked down at the table and realized the woman had left one book behind. It was smaller than the others, bound in faded red leather, with no title or markings on the cover. It was old, The kind of old that makes you feel like you should be wearing gloves just to touch it. For a moment, I debated whether to leave it alone. Every rational part of me screamed that this wasn't my business, that whatever was going on with that woman and her books wasn't something I wanted to be a part of. But curiosity has always been my downfall. I reached out and opened the book. The pages were filled with strange symbols. Not letters, not numbers, just looping, intricate patterns that seemed to move if I looked at them too long. My stomach turned, but I couldn't stop myself from flipping through. The scratching sound grew louder with each page, and I realized it wasn't coming from the room. It was coming from the book. Halfway through, I stopped. There was an illustration, black and white, so detailed it looked almost photographic. It was of the table I was sitting at. The same table, the same room, but empty except for the book itself. My breath caught in my throat. The hairs on my arms stood up. Before I could process what I was looking at, the lights flickered. Just once, quick enough that I might have thought it was my imagination, if not for what happened next. The scratching stopped. The silence that followed was so heavy, it felt like the room was holding its breath. And then, one by one, the books on the nearby shelves began to fall. Not tumble, fall, perfectly straight, like they were being pushed. I bolted up from the chair, the books still in my hands, and backed away from the table. The books kept falling, row after row, faster now, until the entire library seemed to shake. The air felt thicker, charged, like the atmosphere before a lightning strike. And then I heard it, a voice, low and guttural, rising from everywhere and nowhere. Close it. My hands trembled as I looked down at the book. The patterns on the pages seemed alive now, writhing like insects, the shapes twisting into forms that made my brain hurt to look at. Close it, the voice repeated, louder this time, so loud it made my teeth ache. I didn't need to be told a third time. I slammed the book shut and dropped it on the table like it had burned me. Instantly, the noise stopped. The bookshelf stood still. The room was silent again, so abruptly it felt unnatural. I stood there, chest heaving, staring at the book like it might open itself. The library was empty now. Even the woman in the oversized sweater was gone. I don't know how long I stood there before I worked up the nerve to move. When I finally did, I didn't pick the book up. I left it where it was and walked out, my legs shaking with every step. I haven't been back to that library since. I don't know what that book was, or why the woman left it behind. But sometimes, late at night, I swear I can still hear that scratching. Not loud, just faint enough to make me wonder if it's real. And I wonder, too, what would have happened if I hadn't closed it. There's an intersection in my town that everyone avoids. Not because it's dangerous or particularly cursed, at least not in the obvious ways people mean when they say something is cursed. It's just strange. Too strange to ignore, even if no one talks about it outright. The intersection is nothing special to look at. Just a four-way stop in a quiet residential area, framed by a couple of dead trees and a rusted speed limit sign that leans at an awkward angle. During the day, it's almost disappointingly boring. The kind of place you wouldn't notice unless you were specifically looking for it. But at night, when the streetlights buzz and flicker, the intersection takes on a different kind of weight. No one ever seems to linger there after sunset. Cars glide through like ghosts, barely stopping at the signs, like the drivers are afraid the pavement might reach up and grab them if they wait too long. I don't know how else to explain it, but the air feels heavier when you're near it. Thicker, like the space isn't meant to exist, and everyone who crosses through it is doing something they weren't supposed to do. I wouldn't have noticed it at all if it weren't for my bike. I like biking at night. There's something meditative about gliding through empty streets, the world pared down to the quiet hum of wheels on asphalt and the occasional flutter of moths in the glow of a street lamp. It's the kind of solitude that makes everything feel smaller and sharper, like the whole town exists just for you. That night, I took a route I didn't normally take, weaving through unfamiliar streets until I came across the intersection. It was empty when I reached it. No cars, no people, just the faint hum of electricity overhead. I slowed down, coasting to a stop right in the center, and for a moment, I just stood there, straddling my bike, staring at the crumbling edges of the pavement where weeds had started to creep in. The air felt strange, cooler than it should have been, with a faint metallic tang that reminded me of blood or pennies. I told myself it was nothing. I was tired, probably imagining things. I pushed off, intending to keep going, but my bike didn't move. The pedals turned under my feet, but it was like the tires had fused to the ground. I hopped off and checked the wheels, half expecting to find them tangled in weeds or stuck in some invisible pothole, but they were perfectly fine. I pushed the bike forward, and it rolled easily enough. But the second I climbed back on, it wouldn't budge. That's when I noticed the figure. It was standing on the corner opposite me, half hidden in the shadows of a dying oak tree. I couldn't make out any details, just a vague outline of a person too still to be natural. I thought maybe they were waiting to cross the street, but they didn't move. They just stood there, watching me. "Hey!" I called out, more to fill the silence than anything else. My voice felt too loud, swallowed by the air almost as soon as I spoke. The figure didn't respond. I tried to move my bike again, harder this time, but the pedals locked up as though they'd been welded in place. I glanced back at the figure, and that's when I realized they weren't alone. There were more of them now, 3, maybe 4, standing in the shadows along the edge of the intersection. They weren't doing anything, just standing there, their heads tilted slightly to the side like they were trying to figure me out. "Hello?" I said again, my voice smaller now. Still no response. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in the middle of the intersection, my hands gripping the handlebars so tightly my knuckles ached. The figures didn't move closer, but they didn't move away, either. It was like they were waiting for something. Finally, I abandoned the bike. I let it drop to the ground with a hollow clatter and started walking, trying to keep my eyes on the road ahead instead of the figures. My footsteps sounded wrong against the pavement, too loud, too deliberate, like they were being played back to me on a delay. The air grew heavier the further I walked, pressing against my chest and making it harder to breathe. I glanced back once and immediately regretted it. The figures were following me now, their shapes flickering in and out of the streetlights like bad reception on an old TV. I don't remember running, but somehow I made it home. The front door slammed shut behind me, and I collapsed against it, gasping for air. My bike was still at the intersection. I told myself I'd go back for it in the morning, when the sun was up and the world felt normal again. But when I went back, it wasn't there. The intersection looked different in daylight, ordinary, even. The cracks in the pavement were just cracks, the weeds just weeds, the air no heavier than it was anywhere else. But my bike was gone, and there was no sign that anyone had been there the night before. I tried to forget about it, but the figures stayed with me. Their stillness burned into my memory like an afterimage. I stopped biking at night. I stopped taking that route altogether. But no matter how hard I tried to avoid it, the intersection kept creeping back into my life. Once, I found a piece of my bike's chain lying in the middle of my driveway. Another time, I heard footsteps outside my window at 3 a.m., slow and deliberate, pacing back and forth until the sun started to rise. Last week, I found a note tucked under my windshield wiper. It was written on a scrap of paper so thin it was nearly translucent, the words scrawled in jagged, frantic handwriting. "Come back. I don't know what they want, or why they chose me, but I can't shake the feeling that the intersection isn't just a place. It's something else, something alive, something patient, waiting for me to make a mistake." I still hear footsteps sometimes, late at night. Sometimes I catch a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye, just outside the circle of light from the street lamp. You ever feel like something is following you? Not chasing, exactly, but waiting? Like it's in no hurry, because it knows, eventually, you'll come back? There's a cafe in my neighborhood that doesn't exist on any map. Not Google Maps, not Yelp, not even in the half-hearted local brochures you find stacked at bus stops. No advertisements, no Instagram page, no reviews scribbled out on receipts and taped to the wall. It's just there, sandwiched between an old tailor shop and a storefront that's been empty for years, its windows papered over with layers of posters for events that already happened. The sign above the door simply says "Cup," handwritten in looping cursive, the letters fading as though they're trying to erase themselves. It's the kind of place you'd walk past without even noticing, except for the smell. The air outside always carries this faint, intoxicating aroma of something sweet and warm, like cinnamon and freshly baked bread mixed with the ghost of wood smoke. I'd lived in the neighborhood for 3 years before I stepped inside. I don't know why I waited so long. Maybe it felt too much like an invitation, too much like a story waiting to happen, and I wasn't in the right place in my life to let it. But one night, after an exhausting day of work and a relentless drizzle that soaked me through despite my umbrella, I finally gave in. The door opened with a soft chime, the kind of sound that feels like it's welcoming you and rather than announcing your arrival. Inside, the cafe was impossibly small. Just 4 tables, each with mismatched chairs that looked like they'd been stolen from different decades. The walls were covered in a patchwork of faded wallpaper, none of it matching, as if the place had been redecorated in pieces and no one had bothered to finish. A single bookshelf stood in the corner, its shelves crammed with dog-eared paperbacks and old board games missing half their pieces. Behind the counter stood a woman. She looked like she belonged to the cafe in the same way that clouds belong to the sky, not out of necessity, but out of inevitability. Her hair was tied back in a loose braid, streaked with silver that made her age impossible to guess. Her face was lined, but not with wrinkles, more like impressions left by years of expressions that had refused to fade. "First time?" she asked, her voice warm and low, like the crackle of a fire in the distance. I nodded, shaking the rain off my coat. "Take a seat. I'll bring you something." I opened my mouth to ask for a menu, but she was already turning away, pulling a ceramic mug from a shelf and filling it with something steaming. There was a rhythm to her movements, a kind of effortless grace, as though she'd done this 1,000 times and didn't need to think about it anymore. I sat down at the nearest table, the one by the window, and watched as the rain slid down the glass in uneven streaks. When she placed the mug in front of me, I noticed 2 things. First, that the drink smelled like memories I couldn't quite name. Second, that there was no price listed. "How much?" I asked, reaching for my wallet. "Don't worry about that," she said with a smile, and walked back behind the counter. The drink tasted like nostalgia. Not any specific memory, but the feeling of one. The way your chest tightens when you hear a song you haven't thought about in years, or the way the air smells when winter turns to spring and the world feels new again. It was sweet, but not cloying, warm without burning, and it left behind a faint aftertaste of something sharp, like the first hint of an old regret. I didn't mean to stay as long as I did. The rain had stopped after a while, and the cafe was so quiet that it felt like time had slowed down, stretching itself thin and delicate. The only sounds were the occasional clink of a cup against the counter and the faint murmur of a record playing somewhere in the back. A song I didn't recognize, but that felt familiar all the same. It wasn't until I glanced at my watch that I realized how late it had gotten. The woman was wiping down the counter, her movements slow and deliberate. I stood, thanked her, and hesitated at the door. "Will you be open tomorrow?" I asked. She smiled, a small, knowing smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "We're always here when you need us." The words lingered in my mind as I stepped back out into the night. The air was clear now, the rain-washed streets shining under the glow of the streetlights. The next day, I tried to find the cafe again. I retraced my steps, counting the storefronts carefully, but where it should have been, there was only an empty space. The tailor shop was still there. The papered-over windows of the abandoned store were still there, but the cafe was gone. I told myself I'd missed it somehow, that I'd miscounted, or taken the wrong street, or imagined the whole thing in a haze of exhaustion. But the taste of that drink lingered, faint and undeniable, like a whisper you can't unhear. I didn't go looking for it after that, not for a while. But every now and then, when the world felt too heavy or the air seemed too still, I'd catch that scent again, the faint sweetness of cinnamon and wood smoke, and my feet would carry me back to that stretch of road. The cafe was never there when I went looking for it, but sometimes when I wasn't looking, when I was lost in thought or weighed down by something I couldn't quite name, I'd find myself standing in front of it again, as though it had slipped through the cracks of the world just to let me in. And each time, the woman would be there, waiting, her smile soft and knowing. Each time, she'd pour me something different, a drink that tasted like the summer I spent building forts in my backyard, or the thrill of my first kiss, or the quiet ache of losing someone I loved. I never asked her name, never asked how the cafe existed, or why it only appeared when I wasn't looking. Some things, I think, aren't meant to be explained. It's been years now, and I've stopped trying to figure it out. The cafe comes and goes as it pleases, slipping into my life like a song I've forgotten the words to but still hum under my breath. I don't know if it'll ever stop showing up, or if one day it'll vanish for good, leaving behind only the faint memory of something I can't quite hold on to. But for now, I keep walking, and when I smell that sweetness in the air, I know where to go. There's a corner in my apartment I've avoided for 3 years. I call it the cord graveyard, though that's more dramatic than it deserves. It's just a shallow box stuffed with tangled wires, old chargers, obsolete adapters, and random lengths of cable that I keep for no reason other than the vague fear that one day I'll need them. It sits behind the TV stand, collecting dust and existential guilt. Every few months, I tell myself I'll go through it, throw out the ones that don't work, untangle the ones that might, maybe label a few, so I actually know what they're for, but I never do. It feels like too much, like I'd be opening some kind of Pandora's box, except instead of releasing ancient evils, it would just release my own inability to let go. Yesterday, though, something made me finally face it. My phone charger had gone missing, again, and after searching every obvious place it could be, and a few not-so-obvious ones, like inside the fridge because apparently, I've reached that stage of my life, I turned to the graveyard. It was my last resort. I pulled the box out from behind the stand and sat cross-legged on the floor, ready to confront whatever mess I'd created. The first thing I pulled out was an old, fraying iPod cord. The sight of it triggered a memory so vivid it felt like I'd been punched in the chest. I was 22, sitting on the floor of my first apartment, unboxing that iPod like it was a treasure chest. It was bright pink, shiny, and so new it felt untouchable. I remember scrolling through the click wheel for hours, making playlists I was convinced would define me forever. Rainy day feels, power walk anthems, songs to fall asleep to. At the time, it felt like I was building something important, a musical map of who I was. I don't know where that iPod is now, probably at the bottom of some drawer, forgotten. But here was its cord, still alive, still here, like some ghost from a past life. I set it aside and dug deeper into the box. The next thing I pulled out was a VGA cable. Thick, clunky, with those little screws on either end that I always forget to tighten. I had no idea why I still had it, but it reminded me of my college dorm, where I'd hooked up my hand-me-down laptop to an equally hand-me-down monitor. I'd spent hours writing terrible essays and watching questionable TV shows, all on a screen that flickered if you moved it too much. I hated that setup back then, but now, holding the cable in my hand, I felt an unexpected fondness for it. It was a time when everything felt possible, even when nothing worked quite right. As I kept going through the box, I realized how much of my life was tangled up in those wires. Here was the USB hub I bought when I first started working from home, thinking it would solve all my problems. It didn't. Here was the charger for a camera I haven't used since 2014. The pictures are still on a memory card somewhere, waiting to be uploaded. And here was an Ethernet cable, coiled neatly like a little orange snake, from when Wi-Fi felt like a luxury and not a given. By the time I reached the bottom of the box, I wasn't even annoyed anymore. I was fascinated. It was like I'd accidentally curated a museum exhibit about myself, artifacts of obsolete ambitions and forgotten projects. Some of it was laughable, like the Bluetooth earpiece I wore for a week before realizing I looked ridiculous. Some of it was bittersweet, like the HDMI splitter I bought for the movie nights that never happened. And some of it was just confusing, like a power adapter for something. I still don't know what it's for. I sat there for a long time, surrounded by this ridiculous pile of cables, and thought about how easy it is to carry things forward without ever questioning why. Not just cords, but habits, expectations, grudges. All these invisible tangles we don't notice until we're forced to confront them. I could have just thrown the whole box out and been done with it, but that felt too abrupt. I needed to sort through it, piece by piece, and decide what to keep and what to let go. In the end, I did manage to throw some things away. The iPod cord went back into the box, Some things, I decided, were worth keeping even if they'd outlive their usefulness. The VGA cable went into the trash, though not without a little ceremony. The mystery adapter? Still here. I couldn't quite bring myself to let it go, just in case I figure out what it belongs to. But the rest of it? Gone. The graveyard was officially retired. That night, as I lay in bed scrolling through my phone, which I eventually found under the couch cushions, of course, I felt lighter. Not because I'd solved anything major, but because I'd made space, literal and metaphorical, for something new. It's funny how much a box of chords can hold, not just in terms of physical clutter, but in the stories we let ourselves forget. So now I'm wondering, what's the most unexpected thing you've held onto for far too long, and what would it take for you to finally let it go? Or, maybe the better question is, what's the one thing you can't bring yourself to throw away, no matter how useless it might be? I found the notebook in the library, tucked into the gap between two books that didn't belong together. It was one of those black and white composition notebooks, the kind everyone uses in high school, with a cover that felt soft and worn, like it had been handled 1,000 times. There wasn't a title or a name scrawled on the front, no stickers or doodles or anything to suggest who it belonged to. It was just there. I don't know why I picked it up. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the way it felt out of place, like it didn't want to be found but couldn't quite hide itself. Either way, I took it to an empty corner of the library and flipped it open. The first page was blank. So was the second, and the third. I flipped through it quickly, expecting it to be empty, just an abandoned notebook someone had stuffed onto the shelf. But halfway through, I stopped. There was writing, faint and uneven, like it had been scratched into the paper with the dull edge of a pencil. The first sentence read, "Write your question." I stared at it for a long moment, confused. The words were shaky, almost childlike, as if whoever had written them had been in a rush. Or maybe they hadn't wanted to be caught. Below the sentence, the rest of the page was blank, waiting. I don't know what came over me, but I grabbed a pen from my bag and pressed it to the page. "What is this?" I wrote, feeling a little ridiculous. The ink soaked into the paper, the letters sharp and black against the faint gray scratches. Nothing happened. I sat there for a minute, then two, tapping the pen against the edge of the table, waiting for something. Finally, I closed the notebook and started to slide it back onto the shelf. But then, I felt it. A weight, not in my hands, but in the air around me. Like the room had grown heavier, thicker, the way it feels right before a storm. I opened the notebook again. Beneath my question, new words had appeared, written in the same faint, uneven handwriting. "You already know." A chill ran down my spine. I looked around, half expecting to see someone watching me, but the library was quiet. Just rows of shelves and scattered readers hunched over their books, lost in their own worlds. No one had touched the notebook. No one could have. I stared at the page, my heart pounding. What do I know? I wrote, pressing harder this time. The pen felt slippery in my hand. My palms suddenly damp. The words appeared almost immediately, as if they had been waiting just beneath the surface of the page. More than you think. I slammed the notebook shut. I should have left it there. I should have shoved it back between the books and walked away, forgotten about it, pretended it never existed. But I couldn't. The notebook felt alive, its presence buzzing in my hands like it was holding its breath. Against my better judgment, I stuffed it into my bag and left the library. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with the notebook in front of me, the faint hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the room. The notebook was heavier now, though I knew that was impossible. Its weight pressed against me, daring me to open it again. I did. The page was blank again, except for the first line, "Write your question." My hands trembled as I picked up the pen. I hesitated, then wrote, "Who are you?" The response appeared slowly this time, the letters forming one by one as if they were being etched into the paper by an invisible hand. "I'm the thing you left behind." I dropped the pen. The words stared up at me, cold and unyielding. "I don't understand," I wrote, my handwriting jagged and uneven now. "What do you mean?" The response came quicker this time. "You'll remember soon." I didn't sleep that night. The notebook stayed on the table, its presence looming like a shadow I couldn't escape. I wanted to throw it away, to burn it, to bury it at the bottom of the trash where it couldn't follow me. But I couldn't bring myself to touch it. The next day, I brought it to work, tucking it into the drawer of my desk like a secret I couldn't share. I didn't open it all day, but I could feel it there, pressing against my thoughts, drawing my attention back to it again and again. When I got home, the notebook was sitting on my kitchen table. I hadn't taken it out of my bag. I stared at it, my breath catching in my throat. The page was open this time, the words already written, waiting for me. Ask the right question. My hands shook as I picked up the pen. What do you want? I wrote, barely able to keep the letters legible. The response appeared instantly. To finish. Finish what? The words bled through the page, darker this time, as if the notebook was screaming at me, what you started. I closed the notebook, my pulse hammering in my ears. I didn't remember starting anything. I didn't know what it wanted from me, or why it had chosen me. But that night, I dreamed of something I couldn't explain. I was standing in a dark room, empty except for a single table and a chair. The notebook was there, open to the center page. The air was heavy, suffocating, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread as I stepped closer. The words on the page weren't written in ink this time. They were carved into the paper, the edges of the letters raw and jagged. You left me here. When I woke up, the notebook was on my chest. I don't know what it means. I don't know what I left behind, or what the notebook wants me to remember. But every time I open it, I feel myself being pulled closer to something I can't see, but know is waiting for me. You ever feel like there's a part of you you've forgotten, something you didn't even know you'd lost? And now it's found you again, demanding to be seen? The town of Sablecross had a rule. No one went near the stone at the edge of the forest. It wasn't written down, wasn't enforced by any authority, but everyone obeyed. Parents warned their children about it, teachers mentioned it in passing, and even teenagers, emboldened by rebellion, kept their distance. The stone wasn't remarkable at first glance. It stood about 6 feet tall, rough and gray, etched with faint grooves that resembled letters in no known language. What made it unsettling wasn't its appearance, but its presence. The air around it felt different, heavier, charged. Animals avoided it, birds fell silent near it, and if you stood too close for too long, you'd feel it, a low vibration in your chest, like the echo of a heartbeat that didn't belong to you. No one remembered who found it first, or how long it had been there. Some said it predated the town itself, that Sablecross had grown up around it like a wound trying to heal. Others whispered about strange occurrences, the occasional wanderer disappearing near its edge, lights flickering through the trees at night. But these were just stories. I'd never believed them, not until the night I touched it. It wasn't intentional. I was walking home late from the diner, my thoughts tangled with the exhaustion of a double shift, when I decided to take the shortcut through the woods. I hadn't meant to go near the stone, but the path curved in ways I hadn't remembered, and soon enough, there it was, standing in the moonlight like an accusation. The vibration hit me before I realized how close I'd come. It wasn't loud, but it was palpable, a pressure in my chest that made my breath catch. The air smelled strange, metallic and sharp, like the aftermath of a lightning strike. I should have turned back. I knew the stories, knew better than to test them, but something about the stone drew me in. It wasn't curiosity, not exactly. It was something deeper, a pull I couldn't resist, like a thread winding itself around my thoughts. My hand moved on its own, fingers brushing against the rough surface. The grooves were deeper than they looked, and the moment my skin made contact, the world shifted. The forest disappeared. The air around me grew cold, and the ground beneath my feet felt slick and unsteady, like standing on the surface of a frozen lake. The darkness was absolute, broken only by faint pinpricks of light in the distance, flickering like fireflies. And then the voice came. You shouldn't be here. It wasn't a voice in the traditional sense. It wasn't heard but felt, vibrating through my bones, threading itself into my thoughts. It carried no emotion, only weight. Where am I? I asked, my voice shaking. The lights flickered closer, revealing shapes in the dark. They weren't people, not exactly. They were tall and thin, their forms shifting like smoke. their faces blank. They moved slowly, deliberately, circling me like predators assessing prey. "You touched the threshold," the voice said. "You opened the way." "I didn't mean to," I stammered. "I didn't." "Intent does not matter," the voice interrupted. "The stone remembers. It holds what is given." The figures stopped moving. One of them reached out, its arm elongating unnaturally, and its hand, or what passed for a hand, hovered near my face. It felt cold, not just against my skin but in my thoughts, like it was sifting through my memories, pulling at things I didn't want to recall. "Why are you here?" the voice asked again. "I don't know," I said, backing away. But there was nowhere to go. The darkness stretched infinitely, the lights fading as quickly as they appeared. The figure withdrew its hand, and for the first time, I noticed the grooves on its surface, the same faint markings as the stone. They pulsed faintly, glowing with a light that seemed to come from within. "You are not the first," the voice said. "You will not be the last." "What does that mean?" I demanded, my fear giving way to frustration. "What do you want from me?" The light pulsed brighter, and the figures began to move again, their forms weaving together until they became one, their collective shape impossibly large, stretching into the void. "We do not want," the voice replied. "We wait." "For what?" I whispered. The light surged, blinding me, and in that instant, I saw it. The stone wasn't just a marker, wasn't just a relic. It was a doorway, and on the other side was something vast and ancient, something that had been watching, waiting, reaching. And then I was back. The forest was silent, the stone cold beneath my hand. My knees buckled, and I collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air. The vibration was gone, replaced by a hollow stillness that felt even worse. I should have left it there, walked away, and never looked back. But as I stood, I saw it. A faint glow in the grooves of the stone, pulsing rhythmically, like the heartbeat of something alive. The stories had been wrong. The stone wasn't just an artifact, wasn't just a warning. It was a promise. The building was alive in the way old things often are. Not literally, it didn't breathe or move, but its weight seemed to press down on the earth with a kind of awareness, its cracked stone walls and leaning towers exuding a quiet defiance against time. Eva hadn't come to admire it, though. She was here because she was tired of pretending the nightmares weren't hers. The invitation had come folded inside a library book, tucked between the pages of a volume she hadn't even borrowed. She'd found it on her kitchen counter one morning, a slim card with black ink scrawled across heavy parchment. No return address, no signature, just a simple message. "The answers are waiting. Room 7. That had been 3 weeks ago. She hadn't told anyone about it. Who would she tell? But the words followed her, pooling in the edges of her mind every time she caught her own reflection in a dark window or woke, gasping from a dream that evaporated the moment she opened her eyes. The nightmares weren't new, but they were different now. They felt personal, like someone had slipped them into her sleep deliberately, each image threaded with meaning she couldn't quite grasp. A forest with no sky, its trees bleeding light. A face that wasn't hers but smiled like it knew her. A sound that wasn't a sound at all but an ache deep in her chest. So when she found herself standing before the building, a crumbling structure half hidden by skeletal trees, she didn't hesitate. The door opened without a sound, heavy with swinging inward to reveal a hallway bathed in gray light. The air inside was cold, but it carried no smell of decay. The floors were polished to a dull sheen, and the walls were lined with portraits whose painted eyes seemed to follow her as she walked. Room 7 was easy to find. It wasn't marked, but she knew it was there, at the end of the hall, waiting. The door was slightly ajar, the faint glow of candlelight spilling out into the corridor. Her breath hitched as she pushed it open. The room was smaller than she'd expected, its walls lined with shelves that groaned under the weight of books and objects she didn't recognize. In the center of the room stood a table, and on it, a mirror. The mirror was oval, its frame carved from something black and smooth, polished to a shine. It wasn't large, no bigger than a dinner plate, but the way it sat, centered, deliberate, made it impossible to ignore. The surface wasn't reflective. It was dark, like the space between stars, and it seemed to ripple faintly, as though it were made of liquid instead of glass. "You're late." The voice came from somewhere behind her. Eva spun, her pulse quickening. A man stood in the doorway, his silhouette sharp against the dim light. He was tall and thin, his face pale and angular, framed by dark hair that seemed almost too neat. He wasn't dressed like someone who belonged in a crumbling building. His coat was immaculate, his boots polished. "I didn't know there was a schedule," she said, her voice steady despite the unease curling in her stomach. "There always is," he replied, stepping into the room. He gestured to the mirror. "That's yours." "What is it?" "A door." He said it like it was obvious. "To where?" "To what you're hiding from." The words made her chest tighten. "I'm not hiding from anything." He smiled faintly, and the expression made her skin crawl. "They always say that." She turned back to the mirror, her hands curling into fists at her sides. "Why am I here?" "You tell me," he said, leaning casually against the wall. "You're the one who followed the invitation." Her reflection didn't appear in the glassy surface of the mirror. Instead, it showed something else, something that moved like smoke caught in slow motion, tendrils of darkness twisting and folding into shapes she couldn't name. The longer she stared, the more it felt like the shapes were staring back. "Go on," the man said. "Ask it." "Ask it what?" "Why it's following you." Her mouth went dry. "What is it?" He straightened, his smile fading. "It's yours. You brought it here." "I didn't bring anything." "Didn't you?" He stepped closer, his gaze sharp. "The things we bury have a way of growing roots." The mirror rippled, the dark tendrils inside coiling tighter. She couldn't look away. Her reflection appeared briefly, distorted, her features stretched and fractured. And then it was gone, replaced by an image she didn't recognize but knew instinctively. It was the forest from her dreams, the trees shifting and swaying in a windless expanse. Their branches glowed faintly, casting light onto the ground below, where shadows moved without owners. In the center of the forest stood a figure. Not a person, but something else, its shape blurring at the edges. It turned, as though sensing her gaze, and for a moment, its face was hers. The image dissolved, and the mirror went dark again. Eva stumbled back, her heart racing. "What was that?" "The beginning," the man said. He moved to the table, placing his hand on the edge of the mirror. "You don't have to face it, you know. Most don't." "Face what?" "Yourself." The words felt like a blow. She wanted to leave, to walk out of the room and never look back. But her feet wouldn't move. The mirror pulsed faintly, and she felt its pull, like gravity drawing her towards something inevitable. "What happens if I go in?" she asked. He tilted his head. "You see what's real. And maybe, if you're lucky, you come back. And if I don't, then you stay there, with the rest." Her gaze shifted to the shelves lining the walls. The objects on them were strange, small, unrecognizable, yet somehow familiar. She realized with a chill that they weren't random. They were keepsakes, remnants. Each one belonged to someone who had walked into the mirror and never returned. She swallowed hard and stepped forward. The surface of the mirror seemed to lean toward her, rippling faintly in invitation. Her hand hovered over it, and the dark tendrils within writhed, reaching for her. "You're sure?" the man asked, his tone neutral but his gaze piercing. "No," she said. Then she pressed her hand to the glass. It wasn't cold. It wasn't warm. It wasn't anything. The world fell away, and she was gone. I first noticed the woman in the blue coat on my commute to work. She was standing on the train platform, her back to me, looking out over the tracks like she was waiting for something. At first, there was nothing particularly strange about her. She was just part of the crowd. Another commuter lost in the sea of tired faces and hurried steps. But there was something about the way she stood, so still, so deliberate, that made me glance back at her twice. The coat was what caught my attention. It wasn't a modern coat, the kind you'd find at a department store or in an Instagram ad. It was long and heavy, made of deep blue wool, with buttons that gleamed faintly in the morning light. It looked old, like something from another era, but not worn down or shabby. If anything, it looked too perfect, like it had just stepped out of another time and landed here by mistake. When the train arrived, she didn't get on. She stayed on the platform, still staring at the tracks, even as the crowd pressed around her. I didn't think much of it at the time. People miss trains all the time, for all sorts of reasons. But the next morning, she was there again. Same platform, same spot, same coat. This time, I watched her a little more closely. She wasn't holding a phone, or a bag, or anything at all. Her hands were clasped loosely in front of her, and she stood so still that she almost looked like part of the scenery, like a statue someone had placed there as a joke. And when the train arrived, she didn't move. Not even a little. I started noticing her every day after that. She was always there, always in the same spot, always wearing that blue coat. She never boarded the train. She never turned around. She just stood there, staring at the tracks, like she was waiting for something, or someone, to arrive. At first, I told myself she was just a creature of habit. Maybe she worked at the station, or maybe she lived nearby and liked to watch the trains go by. But something about her felt off. Unsettling. The way she didn't move. The way no one else seemed to notice her, even though she was impossible to miss. One morning, I decided to say something. I don't know why. Maybe it was curiosity, or boredom, or just the need to prove to myself that she was real. I walked up to her, clearing my throat awkwardly. "Excuse me," I said. She didn't respond. I took a step closer, trying to catch a glimpse of her face, but the hood of her coat was pulled up, casting a shadow that hid her features. I couldn't even tell if her eyes were open. "Are you okay?" I asked. Still nothing. The train arrived, the noise of it swallowing the air around us, and I gave up, stepping onto the car as the doors hissed shut behind me. I glanced back at her through the window as the train pulled away, and for a split second, I thought I saw her move, just the faintest turn of her head, like she was finally looking at me. That night, I dreamed about her. In the dream, I was standing on the same platform, but it was empty, eerily quiet. The train tracks stretched out into the distance, disappearing into a fog that seemed to swallow everything it touched. She was there, standing in the same spot, her back to me. But this time, when I called out to her, she turned around. Her face wasn't what I expected. It wasn't hollow or skeletal or monstrous. It was just blank. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just smooth, pale skin, like someone had painted over her features. I woke up gasping, the image burned into my mind. The next morning, I told myself I wouldn't look for her. I'd keep my head down, get on the train, and pretend she didn't exist. But when I reached the platform, my eyes went straight to her. She was gone. Her absence was somehow more unsettling than her presence had ever been. I scanned the platform, the station, the street outside, but there was no sign of her. For a moment, I felt relief. Maybe she'd finally boarded a train. Maybe she'd found whatever it was she was waiting for. But as the days passed, little things started happening. I'd catch a flash of blue in the corner of my eye, only to turn and find nothing there. I'd hear faint footsteps behind me, too quiet to be real, but impossible to ignore. And at night, I started dreaming about her again. In the dreams, she was always there, standing just out of reach, her face still blank. Sometimes, I thought I could hear her whispering, though I couldn't make out the words. Other times, she would reach for me, her hand pale and smooth, her fingers curling in a gesture that felt like both an invitation and a warning. One night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps in my apartment. I lay there, frozen, my breath caught in my throat. The sound was soft but deliberate, moving from the living room to the hallway outside my bedroom. I told myself it was just the building creaking, the way old buildings do. But then the footsteps stopped, and I felt it, the unmistakable sensation of someone standing on the other side of the door. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I went to the train station early, hoping to find her, hoping to ask her what she wanted, why she was haunting me. But she wasn't there. Instead, I found the blue coat. It was draped neatly over the lamp post where she always stood, the fabric swaying gently in the breeze. There was no sign of her, no footprints, no trace that she'd ever existed. I didn't touch it. I didn't go near it. But later that night, when I got home, it was hanging on the back of my chair. You ever feel like you've noticed something you weren't supposed to notice, and now it's noticed you back? Something that doesn't belong in your world, but has decided to stay anyway? The clock in the corner ticked louder than it should have, each second stretching thin, snapping into the next like the pluck of a taut string. Kara sat at the edge of the table, her hands flat against the wood. The envelope in front of her was unremarkable, white, creased at the edges, a faint smudge of ink where the address had been hastily scrawled. It had arrived that morning, slipped under her door in a way that suggested urgency but not explanation. No return address, no postmark, just her name, Kara Whitmore, written in a careful, looping script she didn't recognize. She turned it over in her hands, the weight of it unusual, as if the paper held something more than words. When she tore it open, the sound seemed to echo, sharp against the quiet. Inside was a single sheet of parchment, heavy and coarse. The ink was black, but it shimmered faintly as she angled it toward the light. The message was brief. You are owed 3 minutes. They begin at dusk. The simplicity of it made her stomach tighten. She read it again, but the words didn't change, didn't offer any more clarity. She tried to dismiss it as a prank, but the unease coiled in her chest said otherwise. 3 minutes. Of what? From whom? The day passed uneventfully, though the letter stayed with her, the words turning over in her mind like a pebble in her shoe. She went to work, answered emails, walked home through the narrow streets of her neighborhood. But each time she glanced at the sky, the sun seemed lower than it should have been, the light fading faster than usual. By the time she reached her apartment, the shadows had stretched long and heavy, pooling at the corners of the buildings like ink. She locked the door behind her and sat at the table again, staring at the letter. The clock ticked on. When dusk fell, the world outside her window seemed to hold its breath. The noise of the city faded, the distant hum of cars, the chatter of pedestrians. All of it dissolved into an unnatural stillness. Kara stood, the hairs on her arms prickling, and turned toward the window. The street below was empty. The lampposts had not turned on, though the bulbs faintly glowed, as if caught in indecision. And in the center of the street, where the cobblestones shimmered faintly in the dying light, stood a figure. They were tall, cloaked in shadow, their features indistinct. Kara's first instinct was to turn off the light, to pull the curtains and pretend she hadn't seen them. But before she could move, the figure lifted a hand and beckoned. The gesture was slow, deliberate, and though it didn't seem menacing, it left no room for refusal. She grabbed her coat without knowing why and stepped out into the cooling air. The figure waited, unmoving, as she approached. When she was close enough to see their face, if it could be called that, her breath caught. Their features shifted, fluid and unfinished, like a painting wiped clean before the brush could dry. Eyes, nose, and mouth flickered into focus and then dissolved again, leaving only a vague impression of humanity. But their voice, when they spoke, was clear. You are owed 3 minutes, they said. Their tone was calm, almost kind. I don't understand, Kara replied, her voice shaking despite herself. 3 minutes of what? The figure tilted their head slightly, as if surprised by the question. Time returned, they said. Moments taken, choices unmade. Kara's mind raced. She thought of her life, the steady series of days and decisions that had carried her to this moment. What had been taken? What could possibly be returned? I don't remember losing anything, she said. The figure stepped closer, their form shifting subtly, like smoke caught in a breeze. Memory is not the measure of loss, they said. The time is yours. You must decide where to spend it. As they spoke, the street around them seemed to blur, the edges of the world softening. Kara blinked, and the figure was gone. In their place was a door, simple wooden, slightly ajar. Light spilled from the crack, warm and golden. She hesitated, then stepped forward, her hand brushing the smooth grain of the wood as she pushed it open. The room beyond was unfamiliar yet comforting, like the echo of a dream she couldn't quite place. A small table stood at the center, lit by a single candle. On the table was a clock, its hands motionless, and 3 objects, a photograph, a coin, and a key. Her footsteps sounded impossibly loud as she crossed the threshold. She reached for the photograph first. It showed a version of herself she barely remembered. Young, smiling, standing on the edge of a cliff with her father beside her. The wind was in her hair, her eyes bright. It was the last trip they'd taken together before the accident. She set the photograph down, her throat tight, and picked up the coin. It was tarnished, worn smooth by countless hands, its design almost unrecognizable. But she knew it. It was the coin she'd flipped in the parking lot that day, the one that had sent her down one road instead of another. A decision that felt small at the time, but had reshaped her life in ways she still couldn't fully comprehend. Finally, she picked up the key. It was heavy, ornate, the kind of key that belonged to a lock long forgotten. The weight of it settled in her hand, familiar and foreign all at once. She didn't know where it belonged, but she felt its importance deep in her bones. The clock on the table began to tick. 3 minutes. The objects before her shimmered faintly, as though waiting. The candle's flame flickered, casting shifting shadows on the walls. Kara closed her eyes, the choices pressing against her like a tide. The photograph, the coin, the key. Time was hers again. But what would she do with it? I always thought it was strange how the water never froze. The pond behind my childhood home had no name, but it was as constant a feature of my world as the oak tree in the yard or the creaky third step on the staircase. It wasn't large, maybe 30 feet across, and it sat low in a dip in the earth, surrounded by reeds and cattails. My mother used to warn me not to play too close to it. "It's deeper than it looks," she'd say, her voice sharp and urgent, like she knew something about it she wouldn't explain. In the summer, the surface of the water was still and dark, broken only by the occasional ripple of a frog or the dart of a dragonfly. In autumn, the pond reflected the orange and red leaves so perfectly that it looked like a mirror, almost too vivid to be real. But in winter, when everything else in our little corner of the world froze solid, when the trees turned brittle and the air stung your lungs, the pond stayed liquid. As a kid, I thought it was magic. I'd run out into the snow, bundled in my too big coat and mismatched gloves, and crouch at the edge of the water, marveling at how it remained untouched by the cold. Steam would rise faintly from its surface, twisting into the sharp winter air like something alive. I asked my mom about it once. "It's just the way it is," she said, avoiding my eyes. "But why doesn't it freeze?" I pressed. She busied herself with the dishes, her back to me. "Don't go near it," she said, and her tone left no room for argument. I didn't listen. It wasn't that I was rebellious, just curious. The pond drew me in, like a magnet pulling at something deep inside me. I'd sneak out sometimes after dark, when the house was quiet and the only light came from the pale glow of the moon on the snow. I'd sit by the edge of the water, my breath fogging the air, and watch the faint ripples that never stopped, no matter how still the night was. One evening, when I was 12, I got closer than I ever had before. The air was sharp with the kind of cold that makes your skin ache, and the snow crunched loudly under my boots. The pond looked different that night. The water was darker than usual, almost black, and the steam rising from it seemed thicker, twisting in slow, deliberate patterns. I crouched at the edge, staring into the depths. The moonlight didn't reach the bottom, and I couldn't tell how far down it went. It felt endless, like staring into a well that had no bottom. I reached out, hesitating for a moment, and dipped my finger into the water. It was warm. Not lukewarm, but warm like bath water, like something alive. The sensation sent a shiver through me, and I pulled my hand back quickly, wiping it on my coat. That's when I saw it. A shadow, deep beneath the surface, moving slowly. It was faint, almost indistinguishable from the darkness of the water, but it was there. Something large. Something that shouldn't have been able to fit in a pond so small. I stumbled back, my heart racing, and for a moment, I thought I saw the surface ripple, like whatever was down there was moving closer. I didn't go back for a long time after that. Years passed. I grew up, moved out, and left the pond behind. College, work, relationships, they filled my life in ways that made the mysteries of my childhood seem distant and unimportant. But sometimes, in the quiet moments, I'd think about the water that never froze, the shadow that moved beneath the surface. When my mother passed away last year, I had to go back to the house. It felt smaller than I remembered, like the years had shrunk it somehow. The oak tree in the yard was gone, its stump overgrown with moss, but the pond was still there, unchanged. It was winter again, and the snow lay thick on the ground, the air biting at my cheeks as I stood at the edge of the water. The pond looked just as it had when I was a child, dark, liquid, untouched by the cold. I should have left it alone. I told myself I was just being nostalgic, that I wanted to say goodbye to the place that had been such a strange, constant presence in my life. But as I stared into the water, that old pull came back, stronger than ever. I picked up a rock, a small, smooth thing I found half buried in the snow, and tossed it into the center of the pond. The water didn't splash. It rippled, slow and deliberate, the circles spreading out in perfect, unhurried symmetry. But there was no sound, no plop or splash like there should have been. The rock sank, disappearing into the darkness without a trace. The pull was stronger now, almost unbearable. I don't know why I did it. Maybe I just wanted to understand. Maybe I couldn't stand the not knowing anymore. I stepped closer, my boots sinking into the muddy edge of the pond, and leaned forward. My reflection stared back at me, distorted and strange, the steam curling around my face like fingers. And then, something reached up. A hand, or what looked like a hand, broke the surface, its skin dark and slick, its fingers impossibly long. It moved slowly, deliberately, as if testing the air, and then it turned toward me. I couldn't move. My body was frozen, not with fear, but with something deeper, something that rooted me in place. The hand stretched further, its fingers brushing the edge of the pond, and then another hand emerged, followed by a face. It wasn't human. Not exactly. The features were close enough to mimic humanity. A mouth, eyes, the shape of a nose. But they were wrong, twisted in ways that made my stomach churn. Its eyes locked onto mine, dark and endless, and I felt something inside me shift, like a weight pressing down on my chest. The thing smiled. I don't remember how I got back to the house. One moment I was standing at the edge of the pond, staring into those impossible eyes, and the next, I was inside. The door locked behind me, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. I haven't gone back since. The house is still there, sitting empty now. The pond behind it is quiet and unassuming as ever. Sometimes, late at night, I dream about it. I dream about the ripples, the warmth of the water, the shadow moving beneath the surface. And sometimes, when I wake up, I swear I can still hear it calling my name. The road to Somerton doesn't show up on any map. That's the first thing people will tell you if you ask about it. The second thing they'll tell you is that it isn't really a road at all, just a stretch of dirt and gravel that twists through the woods like it's trying to lose itself. Most of the time, it doesn't matter. Nobody lives in Somerton anymore. Nobody's lived there for years. I found out about it the way you hear about most strange places, through a friend of a friend, sitting around a bonfire with the kind of people you don't know well enough to tell they're full of shit. Someone mentioned it casually, like it was no big deal. "There's this road out by the lake," they said, their voice low and conspiratorial, the firelight flickering in their eyes. "You can only find it if it wants you to." I rolled my eyes. What's that supposed to mean? "You'll see," they said, grinning like they knew something I didn't. The thing is, I didn't care about the road. Not at first. I forgot about it almost as soon as the night ended. But a few weeks later, I was driving home from work when I missed my turn. It wasn't a big deal, just one wrong exit off the highway, but it was enough to throw me into a part of town I didn't recognize. The streets were narrow, lined with sagging houses and overgrown lawns. The kind of place that made you double-check your doors were locked. I was trying to find my way back to the main road when I saw it. A sign. It was small, barely legible in the glow of my headlights, and propped against the edge of the road. Somerton, 3 miles. The name tugged at something in the back of my mind. It wasn't until I was halfway down the gravel path that I remembered the bonfire. I should have turned around. The road was narrow, barely wide enough for my car, and the trees pressed in from both sides, their branches arching overhead like they were trying to block out the sky. The farther I drove, the worse it got. The dirt turned to mud, the ruts growing deeper, and my tires skidded as I tried to keep from sliding into the ditch. And then I saw the house. It was perched on the edge of the road, leaning slightly to one side, its windows dark and empty. The paint had peeled away in jagged strips, exposing the gray wood beneath, and the porch sagged under the weight of its own decay. A mailbox stood at the edge of the driveway, its flag raised, though there was no car, no sign of life. I don't know why I stopped. The engine hummed as I sat there, staring at the house, the dirt road stretching out into the darkness ahead. I should have kept driving. Instead, I turned off the ignition and stepped out of the car. The air was thick, the kind of humidity that makes your clothes stick to your skin, and the only sound was the faint buzz of insects in the trees. I didn't see anyone, but I felt like I was being watched. The mailbox was rusted, its paint faded, and when I opened it, a single envelope slid out. It was addressed to no one, just blank paper, folded neatly, tucked into an envelope that felt heavier than it should. I turned it over in my hands, my thumb running along the edge of the seal. For a moment, I thought about leaving it there, shoving it back into the mailbox and walking away. But my curiosity won out. It always does. The envelope wasn't empty. Inside was a photograph. It was old, black and white, its edges yellowed with age, and it showed a group of people standing in front of a house. Not the house in front of me, but one just like it. They were dressed in old-fashioned clothes, the kind you'd see in movies about the 1930s, and their faces were blurred, like the camera had caught them mid-motion. All except one. In the center of the group stood a woman. Her face was sharp, clear, and she was staring directly at the camera, directly at me. She didn't look angry or sad, just aware. I dropped the photo back into the envelope, my hands trembling, and then the porch light turned on. It was dim, flickering faintly, but it sent a shock through me all the same. A bulb that old shouldn't have worked. I took a step back, my pulse hammering in my ears, and then I heard it. The sound of the front door opening. I didn't wait to see who or what was there. I ran back to the car, my shoes skidding in the dirt, and fumbled with the keys until I finally got the engine to turn over. The headlights cut through the darkness as I sped down the road, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. I didn't look back. When I finally made it home, the envelope was still sitting on the passenger seat. I left it there. The next day, I threw it in the trash. But that wasn't the end of it. The following week, I found another envelope. This time, it was on my porch. Same blank exterior, same faint weight, like it was meant for me and no one else. Inside was another photograph. This one showed a different house, but the woman was still there, standing in the same spot, her gaze fixed on the camera, fixed on me. The envelopes kept coming. No matter where I went, they found me. At work, in my mailbox, tucked under the wiper blade of my car. Each one held a photo, and in every photo, she was there. Always watching, always waiting. I tried burning one once. The flames curled the paper, turning it to ash, but the next morning, the same photo was sitting on my kitchen counter, untouched. I stopped sleeping, stopped leaving the house unless I had to. Every shadow felt like her. Every knock at the door sent my heart racing. And then, one night, I woke up to find an envelope on my pillow. I didn't open it. I didn't have to. I already knew what it would show. The road to Somerton doesn't show up on any map, but I think it's waiting for me anyway. The letter arrived folded inside a small wooden box, its edges pressed flat beneath a jagged, hand-carved lid. The box was warm to the touch, which struck Kasia as odd. She had found it on her porch before dawn, where the frost was still thick on the ground. No return address, no markings, just her name etched into the lid in blocky, uneven letters. She opened it carefully, expecting a prank or some bizarre solicitation. Instead, the box exhaled a faint scent of burnt wood and something metallic, like a forge still cooling after use. Inside, the letter was written in a bold, spidery script, each word etched deeply into the parchment. You are owed 3 favors. Tonight, one will be repaid. Kasia stared at the words, her thoughts tangling into knots. She had no idea what this meant. Favors? From whom? A chill ran down her spine that had nothing to do with the morning air. She looked around her empty porch, half expecting someone to step from the shadows with a smirk and an explanation. No one did. She tucked the box under her arm and went back inside, locking the door behind her. She had work in an hour, but the strange message gnawed at the edge of her focus. By the time evening came, she had almost convinced herself it was a mistake. Maybe the box was meant for someone else, though her name had been carved so deliberately. Still, nothing had happened all day, and the world continued as it always did, indifferent to her questions. At precisely 10:12 p.m., a knock sounded at her door. Kasia froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. She wasn't expecting anyone, and the suddenness of the knock, loud, deliberate, made her chest tighten. She approached the door cautiously, peering through the peephole. A man stood on the porch, tall and thin, his features obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. He held a silver cane, though he didn't lean on it, and his coat was neatly buttoned despite the threadbare patches on its sleeves. He looked like someone from another era, misplaced and out of sync with the world around him. Kasia hesitated before opening the door, her voice uncertain. "Can I help you?" The man tipped his hat slightly, his expression unreadable. "It is I who will help you tonight," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "You have been chosen to receive your first favor." "My what?" she stammered, the box from earlier flashing in her mind. The man didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his coat and produced a small vial filled with a dark, shimmering liquid. He held it out to her, the glass catching the porch light in sharp glints. "This," he said, "will solve the problem you do not yet realize you have." Kasia stared at the vial, her pulse roaring in her ears. Every instinct told her to shut the door, to lock it and call someone, anyone, for help. But the man's presence was magnetic, his calm assurance impossible to dismiss. "I don't understand," she said. "What am I supposed to do with it?" "That," the man replied, "is entirely up to you. But know this, a favor given must be accepted, and a favor accepted carries a weight of its own." He placed the vial on the porch railing and tipped his hat again. Before she could say another word, he turned and walked into the darkness, his figure swallowed by the night as though it had never been there at all. Kasia picked up the vial with trembling hands, its weight much heavier than it seemed it should be. The liquid inside shifted sluggishly, catching the light in strange, oily swirls. She placed it on her kitchen counter, staring at it as if it might speak. Hours passed. Midnight came and went, the house silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. The vial sat there, unmoving, though it seemed to exude an almost palpable tension. By morning, Kasia had convinced herself the man was a con artist, though what he could possibly gain from such a bizarre stunt was beyond her. She left the vial where it was and went about her day, ignoring the prickling sensation that something was watching her. It wasn't until the evening news that she understood. A headline flashed across the screen. "Local reservoir contaminated. Hundreds affected by unknown toxin." The anchor's voice was calm but urgent, detailing symptoms that mirrored the nausea and dizziness Kasia had felt the night before. The reservoir was the town's primary water source, and the toxin had gone undetected for weeks. She turned off the television, her mind racing. The man's words echoed in her head. "This will solve the problem you do not yet realize you have." The vial sat on the counter, dark and unreadable. She picked it up, its cool surface pressing against her palm. She spent hours researching toxins, antidotes, anything that might connect the vial to the events unfolding in her town. Nothing made sense, yet a terrible certainty settled in her chest. She stood on the edge of the reservoir as the sun set, the vial in her hand. She had no proof it would help, no guarantee it wouldn't make things worse. But the man's voice whispered in her mind, calm and certain. Kasia unscrewed the cap and poured the liquid into the water. It rippled outward, dark and shimmering, before disappearing entirely. When she returned home, another box waited on her porch. Inside was a second letter. "You have accepted the first favor. The second will find you soon." The weight of the words sank into her, heavier than the vial had ever been. The favor had been repaid, but the price was just beginning. "When I was 9, my grandfather told me that trees could remember things. We were sitting on the porch of his old cabin in the mountains, drinking lemonade that was too sour and too warm, but I was too polite to say anything about it. He leaned back in his chair, his hat pulled low over his eyes, and gestured to the massive oak tree in the yard. "That tree," he said, tapping his finger on the armrest, "knows more about this world than you or I ever will." I squinted at the tree, unimpressed. "It's just a tree," I said. He smiled the kind of smile that grown-ups give kids when they think they're being clever. "It's more than just a tree. They remember things. The rings inside their trunks? Those are like pages in a journal. They hold on to time, like a story that never gets erased." I rolled my eyes in that way only a 9-year-old can. "If it remembers so much, why doesn't it talk?" "It does," he said. "You're just not listening." That was the thing about my grandfather. He had this way of saying things that made you question if he was being serious or just messing with you. He didn't explain further, and I didn't ask. But for the rest of the summer, I couldn't stop thinking about the oak tree. Every time I looked at it, I felt like it was looking back at me, like it was waiting for me to figure something out. Years went by, and the tree became just another part of the background. My parents moved us to the city, and I stopped spending summers at my grandfather's cabin. Life got busy, as it tends to do. School, friends, jobs, relationships. All of it blurred together in a steady march forward, and the memory of that conversation faded into the clutter of my childhood. It wasn't until after my grandfather passed away that I saw the tree again. I hadn't been back to the cabin in over a decade. The place had been left untouched since his death, and when I pulled into the driveway, it was like stepping into a time capsule. The porch sagged under the weight of years, the windows were clouded with dust, and the smell of pine and damp would fill the air. And there was the oak tree, standing exactly as I remembered it, its massive branches stretching toward the sky. It looked the same, but it felt different somehow. Older, heavier. I spent the afternoon going through the cabin, boxing up old photos and notebooks, pausing every so often to sit down and catch my breath. It felt strange being there without him, like the air itself was grieving. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, I was too tired to keep going. That's when I heard it. It was faint at first, a soft creaking sound, like wood bending in the wind. But there was no wind. The air outside was still, the kind of stillness that feels deliberate, like the world is holding its breath. I stepped out onto the porch, the boards groaning under my weight. The sound was coming from the oak tree. I stood there for a moment, staring at it, waiting for something. The sound came again, louder this time. A low groan that seemed to resonate deep in my chest. I told myself it was just the natural sound of the tree shifting, but there was something about it that felt alive, intentional. Without really thinking about it, I walked down the steps and crossed the yard to the base of the tree. Up close, the bark was rough and deeply grooved, like the wrinkles on an old face. My grandfather's words echoed in my head. They hold on to time, like a story that never gets erased. I placed my hand on the trunk, half expecting it to feel warm. It didn't. It was just a tree. A big, old, ordinary tree. And then, just as I was about to pull my hand away, I felt it. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, a faint vibration under my palm, like the tree was humming. I pressed my ear against the bark, and that's when I heard the whisper. It wasn't a voice, not exactly. It was more like the memory of a voice, layered and distorted, like hearing someone call your name underwater. The words were impossible to make out, but the tone was unmistakable. It was my grandfather. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. It couldn't be. He was gone. He'd been gone for years. But the sound came again, faint and broken, like the tree was trying to speak but couldn't quite remember how. "Grandpa?" I whispered, feeling ridiculous even as I said it. The whisper stopped. I stood there, my breath fogging in the cool night air, waiting for something to happen. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, slowly, I noticed something at the base of the tree. A knot in the wood, shaped almost like an eye. It wasn't there before. I was sure of it. I reached out and touched the knot. It felt smoother than the rest of the bark, almost polished. As my fingers brushed against it, a flood of images filled my mind. They weren't mine. I saw my grandfather, younger than I'd ever known him, planting the oak tree in the yard. I saw him sitting on the porch, watching it grow, the years passing like a time-lapse video. I saw him talking to it, telling it stories, secrets, regrets, things he'd never told anyone else. And then I saw myself, a little girl sitting on the porch with a too-warm lemonade, rolling her eyes as he tried to explain the world to her. The images faded as quickly as they came, leaving me dizzy and breathless. I stepped back, staring at the tree in disbelief. It had held on to him, onto his voice, his memories, his life. It had remembered everything. For the rest of the night, I sat at the base of the tree, my back against the trunk, listening. The whispers didn't come back, but I didn't need them to. I knew they were there, waiting, tucked away in the rings of the tree like pages in a journal. When I left the cabin the next day, I didn't say goodbye to the oak tree. It didn't feel necessary. I knew it wasn't going anywhere, and neither was my grandfather. Not really. Now, whenever life feels too loud, too fast, too overwhelming, I think about that tree. I think about the weight it carries, the way it remembers everything, the way it stands so still and quiet in a world that never stops moving. And I wonder, if the trees are keeping our stories, what will mine say when I'm gone? And will anyone be willing to stop and listen? The house on the hill wasn't supposed to be there. Everyone in town knew the story. No construction permits had been issued, no contractors had been hired, and yet, one morning, it was just there. Pale stone walls rose from the mist like an apparition, capped with a roof of dark slate that gleamed even when the sun refused to shine. The windows reflected nothing, and the front door stood shut, framed by pillars carved with symbols no one could decipher. People whispered about it in markets and pubs, casting wary glances up the hill. Some claimed they'd heard music from within, strange and distant, while others swore they'd seen shadows moving behind the windows at night. But no one dared go near it, except me. I'd been watching the house for weeks, ever since the morning it appeared. From the moment I saw it, a gnawing sense of recognition clawed at me, though I couldn't explain why. I'd never seen it before, but it felt familiar, like a dream I couldn't quite remember. It wasn't curiosity that drove me to it. It was something stronger, something deeper, something that felt inevitable. I set out at dusk, the sky a bruised shade of purple, the air heavy with the promise of rain. The path leading up the hill was overgrown, the grass brushing against my legs as I climbed. The closer I got, the quieter the world became, as though the house was swallowing the sounds around it. By the time I reached the top, even the wind had stopped. The front door loomed before me, its surface smooth and unblemished, except for a single mark at the center. A handprint, faint but distinct, pressed into the wood as if someone had leaned there moments before. My own hand hovered over it, the size nearly a match, and for a brief moment, I considered turning back. But then the door opened. It didn't creak or groan. It simply swung inward, revealing a dimly lit corridor that stretched far beyond what the exterior of the house should have allowed. The air inside smelled faintly of cedar and something sharper, metallic, like blood. "Come in," a voice said, soft and inviting. I stepped inside, my pulse quickening as the door closed behind me. The hallway was lined with portraits, each one massive and intricate, their subjects frozen in expressions of muted sorrow or disdain. They weren't of people I recognized, but there was something unsettlingly familiar about them. The angle of a jaw, the tilt of a head, the shape of an eye. The voice came again, this time from deeper within the house. "You've taken your time." It wasn't threatening. It wasn't even unkind, but it carried a weight that made my chest tighten. I followed the sound, my footsteps silent on the polished wood floor. The hallway gave way to a grand staircase, its banister carved with more of those strange symbols. Candles lined the steps, their flames flickering but casting no shadows. At the top of the stairs stood a man. He was tall and lean, dressed in a suit so black it seemed to absorb the light around him. His face was pale and angular, his eyes a piercing gray that seemed to see straight through me. He smiled faintly as I approached, but it wasn't a comforting smile. It was the kind of smile you give when you've been waiting for something inevitable. "You made it," he said, his voice as smooth as polished glass. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice steady despite the storm building inside me. He tilted his head, as though amused by the question. "You already know." "I don't," I said, though even as the words left my mouth, they felt like a lie. He gestured for me to follow him, descending the staircase with a fluid grace that made my own movements feel clumsy. The corridor at the bottom led to a door, smaller than the others, carved with symbols that seemed to shift when I looked directly at them. He opened it without hesitation, revealing a room bathed in golden light. The room was circular, its walls lined with shelves filled with books, artifacts, and objects that defied description. At the center stood a table, and on that table lay a box. It was simple, made of wood, unremarkable except for the fact that I felt like I'd seen it before. "This is yours," he said, stepping aside to let me approach. "I've never seen it before," I said, but even as the words came out, I knew they weren't true. He said nothing, only watched as I moved closer to the table. My hands trembled as I reached for the box, the wood warm under my fingers. The lid slid open easily, revealing a single object inside, a key. It wasn't ornate or unusual, just a simple brass key, worn at the edges as though it had been used often. The sight of it filled me with a strange mix of emotions: relief, dread, longing. I picked it up, its weight heavier than it should have been, and turned to face the man. "What does it open?" I asked. He smiled that faint, knowing smile again. "You'll see." Before I could respond, the room shifted. The golden light faded, replaced by a deep, suffocating darkness. The shelves and table disappeared, and the ground beneath me turned cold and hard, like stone. I wasn't in the house anymore. I was somewhere else, somewhere vast and empty, the air thick with silence. In the distance, I saw a door, its frame glowing faintly. The key in my hand seemed to pulse, urging me forward. I walked toward the door, the darkness pressing against me like a living thing. When I reached it, I hesitated. The door was plain, unmarked, but the sense of finality it carried was overwhelming. I slid the key into the lock, the metal fitting perfectly, and turned it. The door swung open, and beyond it was not another room, not another world, but a mirror. It reflected not just me, but everything I'd ever been, everything I could be. The good, the terrible, the infinite possibilities that stretched out like threads of light and shadow. And then the man's voice came again, soft and steady, as though he were standing right behind me. "Now you understand. The house wasn't waiting for you. You were waiting for it." I stepped through. There's a small town a few hours north of here called Black Hollow. Most people have never heard of it, and the ones who have tend to pretend it doesn't exist. It's not abandoned. It's still listed in old atlases, still has a postal code, but you'd be hard-pressed to find anyone who lives there willing to talk about it. Black Hollow has one rule. If you're walking alone at night and you hear your name called, you don't turn around. I heard about it from a guy I used to work with. He wasn't from there, but his uncle was. One night, after too many beers and a conversation that had drifted into local legends, he told me about the rule. His tone was light at first, like he thought the whole thing was ridiculous, but as the story went on, he grew quieter, his words slower, like he was working his way through something heavy. "It's not just a warning," he said. "It's a survival tip. You hear your name in Black Hollow? You keep walking. Doesn't matter how familiar the voice sounds. Doesn't matter if it's your mom, your best friend, your own damn kid. You don't turn around. Ever." I asked him why, but he wouldn't say. He just shrugged, gave a nervous laugh, and said, "It's better if you don't know." A few months later, I drove to Black Hollow. I don't know why. Maybe it was boredom, or curiosity, or just the fact that I've never been great at leaving things alone. It was one of those towns you'd miss if you weren't looking for it. A handful of streets clustered around a sagging church, the kind of place where every building looks like it's been there for too long. The paint on the houses was faded and peeling, the lawns overgrown with weeds. A single gas station stood at the edge of town, its sign flickering faintly in the midday sun. I parked my car and walked through the main street, which was mostly empty. A few people glanced at me from behind curtains or over their shoulders, but no one said anything. It wasn't a hostile silence, just wary. Like they'd seen people like me before and knew better than to get involved. I wandered for a while, taking in the strange stillness of the place. There were no kids playing, no dogs barking, no sound of radios or lawnmowers. Even the birds seemed to avoid Black Hollow. Eventually, I ended up at the gas station. The clerk behind the counter was a wiry man with gray stubble and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. He barely looked at me as I paid for a soda, but as I turned to leave, he said, "You're not from here." "No," I said, "just passing through." His eyes flicked up to meet mine, and for a moment, his expression was unreadable. "Then don't stay out after dark." The sun was setting by the time I made my way back to my car. I'd planned to leave, but something kept pulling at me, a nagging feeling that I hadn't found what I was looking for yet. I told myself I'd stay just a little longer, drive around the outskirts of town, see if there was anything worth seeing. The road leading out of Black Hollow was narrow and lined with trees, their branches arching overhead like the ribs of some giant, ancient creature. The further I drove, the darker it got, the headlights of my car barely cutting through the shadows. That's when I heard it. My name. At first, I thought it was the wind, or maybe the echo of a song stuck in my head. But then I heard it again, clearer this time. A woman's voice, soft and familiar, calling my name from somewhere behind me. I slowed the car, my heart pounding. The voice was so clear, so certain, that it felt impossible to ignore. But I didn't stop. I drove a little further, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, trying to convince myself I'd imagined it. But then I heard it again, louder this time, closer. It was my mother's voice. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt in the middle of the road. I hadn't seen my mom in over a year, not since she moved across the country to be closer to her sister. But the voice, it was her. There was no mistaking it. "Wait," she called, her tone pleading. "Just wait. Please." Every instinct in my body told me to turn around, to get out of the car, to run toward her, to ask her what the hell she was doing here, in the middle of the woods, miles from anywhere she was supposed to be. But then I remembered the rule. If you hear your name called, you don't turn around. I sat there for what felt like forever, my hands gripping the steering wheel, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The voice kept calling, over and over, growing more desperate, more insistent. It wasn't just my mom anymore. It was my best friend, the one I hadn't seen since the fight we had last year. It was my brother, who lived 3 states away. It was my own voice, pleading, sobbing, screaming my name. I didn't turn around. Eventually, the voices stopped. The silence that followed was worse. I drove straight home that night, my hands shaking so badly I could barely keep the car on the road. When I got back to my apartment, I locked every door, closed every curtain, and sat in the dark, trying to make sense of what had happened. The next day, I called my mom. She picked up on the second ring, her voice cheerful and warm, completely oblivious to the fact that she'd been calling my name in the woods the night before. I didn't tell her about Black Hollow. I didn't tell anyone, but sometimes late at night, I hear it again. My name, whispered softly from the hallway, or from the street outside, or from the dark corner of my bedroom. I don't turn around, and I don't go back to Black Hollow. The elevator in Rosewood Apartments had always been temperamental. It groaned and shuddered when it moved, its lights flickering with every passing floor. People joked that it was held together by little more than duct tape and a prayer. Still, it had always worked well enough for Eliza, who lived on the 11th floor and wasn't keen on climbing stairs. That evening, as she stepped inside carrying a bag of groceries, the elevator seemed no different than usual. The panel of buttons glowed dimly, and a faint hum filled the space as the doors slid shut behind her. She pressed 11 and leaned against the wall, her thoughts already wandering to the email she needed to send and the laundry she'd forgotten to fold. The elevator jerked once, then began to ascend. She counted the floors out of habit. 1, 2, 3. The hum grew louder. 4. The lights flickered, casting strange shadows on the scratched walls. 5. The elevator slowed for a moment, as if considering its next move, before lurching forward with a sudden burst of speed. And then it stopped. Eliza stumbled as the motion ceased, her heart skipping. The lights overhead sputtered, plunging her into a moment of total darkness before they steadied into a dim, flickering glow. She glanced at the buttons, hoping to see the familiar orange glow of her floor, but they were all dark. Every single one. "Great," she muttered, pressing the emergency button. Nothing happened. She pressed it again, harder this time, but there was no response. Her phone was in her pocket, but when she pulled it out, the screen refused to light up. She swiped at it, growing frantic, but the device remained lifeless. "Hello," she called out, her voice echoing slightly in the confined space. "Is anyone there?" No answer. The elevator remained still, the air inside growing heavier. The faint hum, which had been a constant since she stepped inside, had vanished, leaving behind an unnatural silence. Eliza tried prying the doors open, but they didn't budge. Her breathing quickened, her chest tightening as the reality of her situation sank in. Then, a sound, soft at first, barely perceptible over her own ragged breaths. A faint tapping, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from above her. She froze, her pulse pounding in her ears. "Hello?" she called again, this time louder. "Who's there?" The tapping stopped. The silence stretched, thick and oppressive. Eliza pressed herself against the wall, her eyes fixed on the ceiling. The panel above her was a simple metal hatch, the kind maintenance workers used to access the top of the elevator. It was bolted shut, but now she couldn't stop staring at it, waiting for something to happen. The tapping resumed, louder this time, as if someone, or something, was walking across the roof of the elevator. Eliza's mind raced. There was no way someone could be up there. The elevator shaft was sealed, wasn't it? But the sound was unmistakable, growing closer, each step deliberate and unhurried. She clutched the railing, her knuckles white. "This isn't funny," she shouted, her voice shaking. "Whoever's up there, stop it." The steps stopped directly above her. A new sound followed, a metallic creak, low and guttural, as if the hatch were straining under pressure. The bolts holding it in place began to twist, one by one, with a slow, deliberate rhythm. Eliza's stomach lurched. She pressed herself harder against the wall, her mind screaming at her to move, to do something, but her body refused to obey. The final bolt fell loose, and the hatch swung open. For a moment, nothing happened. The opening gaped above her, dark and foreboding, revealing nothing but the black void of the elevator shaft. Then, a hand. It was impossibly long, the fingers thin and stretched, the skin pale and waxy like something preserved for too long. The hand gripped the edge of the hatch, its nails scraping against the metal as another hand followed. Then an arm, then a head. Eliza couldn't scream. She couldn't move. The thing that emerged from the hatch wasn't human, though it wore the suggestion of a face. Its features were smooth, like clay smeared by careless hands, with faint indentations where eyes and a mouth should have been. It moved with a strange, liquid grace, lowering itself into the elevator with an elegance that defied its grotesque form. "Please," Eliza whispered, her voice barely audible. "Please, no." The creature tilted its head, as if considering her words. Its featureless face leaned closer, and for a terrible moment, she thought it might speak. But instead, it reached out, its long fingers brushing against her cheek. Its touch was cold, sending a jolt through her that left her gasping. The lights flickered once, then went out completely. Eliza's world plunged into darkness. The hum returned, louder now, a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to come from within her own chest. She felt the elevator lurch, its motion jerky and erratic, as if it were moving again. The creature's presence was palpable in the dark, its cold fingers still pressed against her skin. When the lights flickered back on, she was alone. The elevator dinged softly, its doors sliding open to reveal the 11th floor. The hallway looked as it always had, warm and familiar, the scent of someone's cooking wafting faintly through the air. Eliza stumbled out, her legs shaky, her mind reeling. She turned to look back, but the elevator was empty, its interior bathed in an ordinary glow. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, the screen lighting up as if nothing had happened. A message from her boss flashed across the screen, reminding her about tomorrow's meeting. The time read 7:24 p.m., exactly 3 minutes after she'd stepped into the elevator. She didn't sleep that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the featureless face, felt the cold touch of its fingers. The next morning, she took the stairs. There's a woman who comes to the library every Thursday and reads the same book. She always sits at the farthest table, near the big window overlooking the oak trees in the courtyard. The light filters through the glass just right in the afternoons, painting her in streaks of gold and shadow. She's probably in her late 30s, with dark, shoulder-length hair and a pair of wire-rimmed glasses that look just a little too large for her face. She doesn't stand out, not at first, but she always has that book with her. The same one, every time. I noticed her during my first week working at the library. It wasn't anything remarkable at first, just another patron quietly minding her business. But after a few weeks, I started recognizing the rhythm of her visits. Every Thursday, right after lunch, she'd walk in, always carrying the book under her arm. She'd head straight to her spot by the window, sit down and read for hours. That in itself wouldn't have been strange. What was strange was the book. It wasn't one of ours. I'd been shelving books long enough to recognize the titles and covers in our collection, and hers didn't belong. It was small and worn, with a dark green cover and no title, no author, no markings of any kind. Just a blank, faded surface that almost seemed to absorb the light. I tried to sneak a look at it once when she went to the bathroom. I wasn't proud of it, but the curiosity had been eating at me for weeks. The moment she stepped away from her table, leaving the book open on the polished wood, I wandered over, pretending to straighten chairs. When I got close enough to see the pages, I froze. The words were written in a language I didn't recognize. It wasn't just unfamiliar, it was wrong. The letters twisted and curled in ways that didn't seem possible, like they were written to be looked at, not read. They almost seemed to move, shifting slightly as I stared at them, though that might have been my imagination. I couldn't help myself. I reached out, just to touch the edge of the page. The moment my finger brushed the paper, a shock ran through me. Not like static electricity. This was deeper, sharper, like a pinprick straight to my chest. I jerked my hand back, my heart racing. The air around me felt heavier, the faint smell of old paper giving way to something sharper, like burned wood. I turned quickly, almost tripping over my own feet as I rushed back to the front desk. When the woman returned a few minutes later, she didn't seem to notice anything was off. She just sat down, adjusted her glasses, and kept reading. That should have been the end of it. I should have ignored her after that, let her be another quiet mystery in the background of my life. But I couldn't stop thinking about that book, about the way the words moved, the way the air shifted when I touched it. The next Thursday, she came back. This time, I kept my distance, watching her from behind the desk as she read. She was completely still, her eyes moving steadily across the pages. Occasionally, she'd reach for a thermos in her bag and take a small sip of whatever she was drinking. I decided to test something. "Hey, Angela," I said, calling over to my coworker who was shelving books nearby. "Do you see that woman by the window?" Angela glanced over, squinting. "Which one?" "The one with the green book," I said, pointing. She looked again, her brow furrowing. "There's no one there." My stomach twisted. "What do you mean?" "She's right there." Angela set down the book she was holding and walked over to the desk, peering out at the window table. "I see the table," she said slowly, "but no one's sitting at it." I stared at her, then back at the woman. She hadn't moved. She was still reading, still sipping from her thermos like nothing was wrong. I didn't say anything else. Angela gave me a strange look and went back to shelving, but my mind was racing. Over the next few weeks, I started paying closer attention. It wasn't just Angela. No one else seemed to notice the woman. I asked a few other coworkers about her, casually at first, but they all gave me the same confused look. One of them even walked over to the window table and wiped it down, passing right through where the woman was sitting. It didn't make sense. One Thursday, I decided to confront her. I waited until the library was quiet, just before closing, and walked over to her table. She didn't look up as I approached, her eyes fixed on the book. "Excuse me," I said, my voice hesitant. She didn't respond. I cleared my throat. I don't mean to bother you, but I've noticed you come here a lot. With that book. This time, she looked up. Her eyes were dark, almost black, and they locked onto mine with an intensity that made me take a step back. Yes, she said, her voice calm but cool, like she'd been expecting this. What is it you're reading? I asked, nodding toward the book. She tilted her head, studying me for a moment before closing the book gently. It's not something you'd understand. Try me, I said, though my voice wavered. She smiled then, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was sharp, almost predatory. It's a story, she said. A story that changes every time I read it. What do you mean? She tapped the cover with one long, pale finger. The book shows what you need to see. Sometimes it's the past, sometimes the future, sometimes things that shouldn't exist. I felt a chill run down my spine. Why do you come here to read it? Her smile faded. Because this place is safe, she said simply. For now. For now. She didn't answer. Instead, she stood, slipping the book into her bag. You've been watching me, she said, her tone flat. That's dangerous. I just don't. Her voice was sharp now, cutting me off. Curiosity can be fatal. With that, she turned and walked toward the door. I wanted to follow her, to demand answers, but my legs wouldn't move. I stood there, frozen, as the door swung shut behind her. That was 3 weeks ago. She hasn't come back since. The table by the window feels emptier now, like it's missing something important. But sometimes, when the light hits it just right, I think I can see the faint outline of a book, sitting there, waiting for someone to notice it. I don't go near it, but I can't stop thinking about the words. There's a vending machine in the lobby of my office building that nobody ever uses. Not because it's broken or empty or in a weird spot. No, it works fine, and it's right next to the elevators, where you can't miss it. But it only sells one thing. Unmarked cans? No logos, no labels, just plain silver cylinders stacked neatly behind the glass, each one identical to the next. I've worked here for 3 years, and I've never seen anyone buy one. I didn't think about it much until the day the elevator broke. It was mid-afternoon, the kind of sluggish hour where the air conditioner hums a little too loud and everyone's counting down to quitting time. I was heading out to grab a late lunch when I saw the out-of-order sign taped to the elevator doors. I groaned and turned toward the stairwell, but that's when I noticed the vending machine. Someone had bought a can. The little metal spiral in the machine was twisted all the way back, and the tray at the bottom held a single silver can. For some reason, the sight of it stopped me in my tracks. After years of walking past that machine without a second thought, I suddenly couldn't look away. I glanced around the lobby. It was empty except for the receptionist, who was tapping away on her keyboard with a bored expression. I turned back to the vending machine, my curiosity outweighing my hunger. Before I could think twice, I pulled a crumpled dollar bill from my pocket, fed it into the slot, and pressed the only button on the machine. The can clunked into the tray with a dull, metallic sound. I reached in and pulled it out, the metal cool against my palm. It was heavier than I expected, though it was the same size as a regular soda can. I tilted it, listening for the familiar slosh of liquid, but there was nothing. No sound, no movement. It was as if the can were solid. I should have left it alone. I should have dropped it in the nearest trash bin and walked out the door. But something about it felt deliberate, like it was meant for me. Back at my desk, I turned the can over in my hands, searching for any kind of markings, a brand, a logo, even an expiration date. There was nothing, just smooth, featureless metal. My coworkers were too absorbed in their own screens to notice, and I didn't bring it up. I didn't want to explain why I'd spent money on something so obviously strange. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, but the can sat on my desk like a question I couldn't answer. That night, after a dinner I barely tasted and a string of TV episodes I couldn't focus on, I decided to open it. I don't know what I expected. Maybe some kind of powder or a weird liquid. Something that would justify its weight and its silence. But when I peeled back the tab, the can hissed softly, and a folded piece of paper slid out. I froze. It wasn't big, just a small, crumpled square. like the kind you'd find stuffed into a pocket. My heart was racing as I unfolded it, and what I saw made me stop breathing for a moment. It was my handwriting, a note I'd written months ago, scrawled in pen on the back of an old receipt. I'd forgotten about it completely. It was just a stupid little to-do list. A pick up dry cleaning, a buy cat food, a call mom. I stared at the paper, my stomach twisting into knots. It was impossible. The note had been in my jacket pocket. I remembered crumpling it up and tossing it into the trash when I got home that night. There was no way it could have ended up here, inside this can. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I couldn't stop thinking about the vending machine. I barely made it through the morning before I found myself back in the lobby, standing in front of it with another crumpled dollar in my hand. My palms were sweaty as I fed the bill into the slot and pressed the button. The can dropped into the tray, and I grabbed it like it might disappear if I didn't act fast. I brought it back to my desk, ignoring the confused glance from my coworker, and opened it right there. Another piece of paper slid out. This time, it was a photo. A picture of me, sitting at my desk. My stomach churned. The photo wasn't new. It was at least a year old. I recognized the outdated layout of my cubicle, the mug I'd broken months ago sitting beside my keyboard. I'd never seen this photo before. Who had taken it? And how had it ended up in the can? I tried to tell myself it was a coincidence, a prank, something explainable, but I couldn't stop. I went back to the vending machine the next day, and the next, and the next. Every time. The can contained something personal, an old ticket stub from a concert I went to 3 years ago, a childhood drawing I'd forgotten about, a receipt from a diner I visited on a road trip 5 states away, things that should have been lost, discarded, buried in the chaos of time, but somehow found their way into those silver cans. I started collecting them, lining them up on the shelf in my apartment like trophies from a scavenger hunt I hadn't signed up for. But the more I found, the more questions I had. Where were these things coming from? How were they ending up here, in a vending machine in the lobby of my office building? And then one day, the machine stopped working. I went down to the lobby, dollar bill in hand, only to find the machine unplugged, a bright orange sign taped across the front that said, "Out of service." I panicked. I asked the receptionist what had happened, but she just shrugged. "Nobody uses it anyway," she said. "It's probably getting replaced." That was weeks ago. The machine is still there, dark and silent, the can sitting untouched behind the glass. I check it every day, hoping it'll spring back to life, but it never does. The collection on my shelf feels incomplete now, like a puzzle missing its last piece. I still don't know why the machine chose me, why it gave me those pieces of my life, or what it wanted me to do with them. But sometimes, when I walk past it, I feel that same pull, that same sense of something deliberate, something waiting. You ever feel like the universe hands you something without explaining why, and you can't decide if it's a gift, a warning, or a test? Something so specific it can't be random, but so strange it doesn't make sense? When I was younger, I used to think that keys were the most magical objects in the world. Not because they opened doors, that was the obvious part, but because they hinted at something unknown. A key always implied the existence of something else. A room you hadn't seen, a box you hadn't opened, a world you hadn't yet stepped into. Even as an adult, I've never entirely let go of that feeling. Which is probably why, when I found the key on my kitchen counter last Thursday, I couldn't stop staring at it. It was small, plain, and silver, with no markings to identify what it belonged to. It wasn't one of mine. I know this because my entire life operates on exactly 3 keys. One for my apartment, one for my car, and one for the storage locker I've been meaning to empty out for years. I even keep them on a single ring to avoid confusion. But this key? It didn't belong to the set. It was just sitting there, by itself, next to the fruit bowl, as if it had always been there and I was just now noticing it. I picked it up and turned it over in my hand. It didn't look old, but it felt worn in a way that suggested use. The edges were smoothed down, and there was a faint scratch near the base, like someone had jammed it into a lock that didn't quite fit. I checked the counter for a note, something to explain its presence, but there was nothing. Just the key, sitting there like a question I hadn't asked yet. The strange thing is, I don't remember anyone being in my apartment recently. I don't host dinner parties, and I don't have a roommate. My social life is largely confined to the occasional coffee shop conversation and the rare, "Hey, can you water my plants while I'm out of town?" favor. And yet, here was this key. I wondered if I'd absent-mindedly picked it up somewhere and forgotten about it, but that didn't make sense either. I'm not the type of person who carries around stray keys like loose change. For the rest of the day, the key stayed on the counter. Every time I walked past it, I felt its presence, as if it was watching me, waiting for me to do something. I tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. By evening, I gave up pretending I wasn't obsessed and decided to figure out where it came from. The first thing I did was try all the locks in my apartment. The door, the windows, the cabinet where I keep my important papers, even the junk drawer that hasn't been properly opened since I moved in. Nothing. The key didn't fit. I felt vaguely disappointed, as though I'd been expecting it to lead me to some hidden passageway that had been lurking in my apartment all this time. I moved on to the storage locker in the basement. No luck there either. By the time I got back upstairs, I was starting to wonder if the key was even meant for me at all. That night, I dreamed about doors. There were hundreds of them, stretching endlessly in all directions, each one a different color and size. Some were grand, with ornate carvings and heavy brass handles, while others were simple, almost unnoticeable. I had the key in my hand, but every time I tried to use it, the door would vanish before I could unlock it. I woke up feeling restless, the image of those vanishing doors still fresh in my mind. The next morning, the key was still on the counter, exactly where I'd left it. It felt heavier than it had the day before, though I knew that was impossible. It was just a key, a small piece of metal that shouldn't have had the power to take up so much space in my thoughts. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that it meant something, that it was waiting for me to figure out what. I spent the day searching, not just my apartment, but the entire building. I walked down every hallway, trying the key in every lock I could find. Doors to storage rooms, utility closets, even the mailboxes in the lobby. Nothing. A few neighbors gave me strange looks, but no one said anything. By the time I finished, I was sweaty, frustrated, and no closer to solving the mystery. Back in my apartment, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the key like it might suddenly start speaking and explain itself. I thought about throwing it away, just to get rid of the weight it was putting on my mind, but the idea felt wrong. You don't throw away a key, not unless you know what it opens. It felt like breaking some unspoken rule, like giving up on a story before you've read the last page. That evening, as the sun set and cast long shadows across my apartment, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A faint scratch on the floor near the edge of the bookshelf, as though it had been dragged a few inches and then moved back. I don't remember ever moving the bookshelf. It's one of those heavy, floor-to-ceiling ones that takes two people to budge. But the scratch was there, undeniable. My heart started pounding as I stood up and approached the bookshelf. I didn't know what I was expecting to find. Maybe nothing, maybe everything. But I couldn't stop myself. I grabbed the sides and pulled. It didn't move at first, but then, with a groan of wood against wood, it shifted a few inches. And there, behind it, was a door. It wasn't large, maybe 3 feet high, with peeling paint and a brass keyhole that was just slightly too ornate for the rest of the apartment. I knelt down, the key suddenly heavy in my hand, and slid it into the lock. It fit perfectly. For a moment, I hesitated. There's a strange kind of fear that comes with the unknown, even when it's something you've been searching for. I thought about walking away, about pushing the bookshelf back and pretending I'd never found the door at all. But I couldn't. I had to know. The lock turned with a soft click, and the door creaked open. What I found on the other side was not what I expected. A narrow staircase, winding downward, lit by a faint, flickering light that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The air smelled faintly of earth and something else, something metallic. I stood at the top of the stairs for a long time, debating whether to go down. Part of me wanted to turn back, to leave the door open and let someone else discover whatever lay beneath. But the other part, the part that had been holding onto the key, imagining its story, knew I had to see it through. I stepped onto the first stair, and then the second, the sound of my footsteps swallowed by the darkness below. Whatever was waiting for me, I knew it wasn't going to be simple. But then again, it never is it? A key doesn't just open a door. It opens a story, and once you've turned the lock, there's no going back. The box had arrived without a return address. Lying on the front porch in the weak morning light, it looked ordinary enough. Plain brown cardboard, sealed with packing tape, and slightly crushed on one corner as though it had been dropped. But there was no sound when Lena shook it, no weight to suggest anything was inside. Only her name was written on it in block letters. No street, no city, no postage stamps. Just Lena. She thought about leaving it there. The idea of touching it made her stomach churn, like something inside her knew the box was more than it seemed. But curiosity gnawed at her, sharper than her unease. She brought it inside and set it on the kitchen table, where the early sunlight painted long shadows over its surface. She fetched a knife from the drawer, hesitated for a moment, and cut through the tape. The box flaps peeled back easily, revealing a layer of soft black fabric, wrapped tightly around an object she couldn't yet see. Carefully, she reached in and lifted the fabric out. Inside was a mirror, small enough to fit in her hand. It was framed in tarnished silver, its edges carved with swirling patterns that seemed to shift when she wasn't looking directly at them. The glass itself was dark, not like a normal mirror. It didn't reflect her face or the room, only an empty blackness, like the surface of a still pond at midnight. The air in the kitchen seemed heavier now, the hum of the refrigerator suddenly too loud. She turned the mirror over, searching for an explanation, but there was nothing. No inscription, no maker's mark, just the weight of the thing in her hand, heavier than its size should allow. That night, she dreamed of a room she didn't recognize. It was empty except for a single chair in the center, its back turned toward her. The walls were gray, the floor bare, the light dim and directionless. The air smelled faintly of wet stone, and she could hear a faint, dripping sound in the distance, rhythmic and deliberate. The chair moved. Not much, just a slight tilt, as though someone unseen had shifted their weight. She wanted to turn and leave, but her feet wouldn't move. Something inside her whispered, "Stay." She woke with a gasp, her heart racing. The mirror sat on her nightstand, though she was certain she'd left it on the kitchen table. She reached for it cautiously, her fingers brushing its cool surface. This time, the blackness within wasn't empty. Shapes moved in the depths, faint and indistinct, like shadows swimming beneath a sheet of ice. The dreams continued over the following nights, growing sharper, louder. The chair was always there, though she never saw who sat in it. Sometimes, the drip turned into a low hum, a sound she could feel vibrating in her chest. Sometimes, she thought she heard whispers, though she couldn't make out the words. The real world began to shift, too. Her reflection in other mirrors grew distorted. At first, it was subtle, a flicker, a faint ripple, like the surface of water disturbed by a pebble. But soon, the changes became impossible to ignore. Her face in the bathroom mirror looked wrong, not entirely hers. Her eyes seemed too deep, her skin too pale, her smile sharper than it should have been. The breaking point came on the 7th night. She sat in her living room, the mirror clenched in her hand, unable to look away. The shadows inside had grown bolder, their movements more deliberate. As she stared, a faint glow emerged in the center of the darkness, pulsing rhythmically. A voice followed, faint but growing louder with each beat. "Come closer." She dropped the mirror. It hit the floor but didn't shatter, the blackness inside swallowing the light around it. She backed away, her breath catching in her throat. The voice came again, louder now, vibrating in her skull. Closer. The room spun, the walls rippling like the surface of a lake. The glow from the mirror pulsed in time with her racing heartbeat. She closed her eyes, pressing her hands to her ears, but the voice cut through her defenses like a blade. "Come." When she opened her eyes, she was back in the gray room. The chair was empty now, its wooden legs crooked as though it had been thrown aside. In its place stood a figure, its shape indistinct, its edges shifting like smoke. It had no face, only a void where features should have been, but it was watching her. She could feel it. "What do you want?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The figure tilted its head, the movement slow and deliberate. "You opened the box." "I didn't know." It doesn't matter. The voice was low and resonant, filling the room like a rising tide. You've been chosen. For what? To carry the mirror. The figure stepped closer, and the temperature in the room plummeted. It is not a burden, it said, though its tone suggested otherwise. It is a purpose. I don't want it, Lena said, her back pressing against the cold wall. You've already taken it. The figure raised a hand, or something like a hand, and pointed at the mirror, which now floated between them. The blackness inside swirled, and for a moment, Lena saw herself within it, her face pale and her eyes hollow. The reflection smiled. What happens if I refuse? She asked, her voice barely audible. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it gestured toward the mirror, and the shadows within surged outward, wrapping around her like a suffocating fog. She couldn't breathe, couldn't move, as the darkness pressed into her, through her, filling every corner of her being. She screamed, but the sound was swallowed before it could leave her throat. When she opened her eyes, she was back in her living room. The mirror sat on the floor where she had dropped it, the blackness within calm and still. She reached for it, her hands trembling, and when she looked into its depths, she saw herself. Her reflection was perfect, normal, hers, but it smiled before she did. The first thing that struck me about the room was how quiet it was. Not the quiet of peace, but the kind that hummed with tension, the kind that made you aware of your breathing. I wasn't supposed to be there. I knew that much. The door had been locked when I found it, but the key was hanging from a nail nearby, as if someone wanted me to open it. The hall outside had been dim, its walls covered with faded wallpaper curling at the edges, but this room was untouched by time. The light filtering through the single window was sharp and golden, throwing long shadows across the floor. It was empty, except for a small table in the center and a chair pushed neatly beneath it. On the table sat a stack of letters, yellowed and bound with a thin red ribbon. The air smelled faintly of lavender and something else, something metallic, like old coins. I approached the table slowly, my footsteps muffled by the worn rug that covered the floor. The letters called to me, not audibly, but in the way certain objects seem to hold an unspoken invitation. My hand hesitated over them, and for a moment, I considered walking away. But curiosity is a hungry thing, and I was already too far in to stop. The ribbon came undone easily, and I unfolded the top letter with care. The handwriting was meticulous, each line precise, but the words made no sense at first. They were fragmented, disjointed thoughts about things I didn't recognize. Names that felt familiar but weren't, descriptions of places that seemed impossibly vivid yet unreal. And then, toward the bottom of the page, there was a single line written in a heavier hand. You will come, and you will remember. I shivered, not from cold but from the weight of something I couldn't name. The letters beneath the first felt heavier now, as though they were holding something more than ink and paper. I opened another, then another, each one filled with the same fragmented words, the same sense of something just out of reach. The last letter was different. Its paper was newer, the ink darker, and it was addressed to me. I froze, my name scrawled across the top in bold, deliberate strokes. The handwriting was unfamiliar, yet it carried a strange weight of recognition, as if I'd seen it in a dream. My hands trembled as I unfolded it. You found it. You were always going to. The house has been waiting, and so have I. You don't remember yet, but you will. Look behind you. I dropped the letter, my pulse quickening as I turned. The room was empty. The door I had come through was still closed, the window unchanged, but the quiet had shifted, no longer humming but heavy, pressing against my ears. The table creaked faintly as I turned back to it, and the letters were gone. In their place was an object I hadn't noticed before. A small glass sphere, no larger than a plum, resting on the table's surface. Inside, a faint light flickered, soft and golden, like a firefly caught in amber. I picked it up without thinking, the glass cool against my skin. The light pulsed faintly, and as I held it, I felt something stir deep in my chest, a sensation both foreign and familiar. A memory? A warning? I couldn't tell. A sound broke the silence then, faint and distant, like footsteps echoing through a long hallway. They grew louder, closer, until I realized they weren't coming from outside the room. They were coming from the glass sphere in my hand. I set it down quickly, stepping back as the light inside began to change, deepening to a fiery orange. The footsteps faded, replaced by a voice. Not a whisper, but something deeper, resonating like the chime of a bell. "You've come too soon," it said, the words vibrating through the room. "What are you?" I asked, my voice shaking. The light flared, filling the room with an intense glow, and for a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing in it, a shadow without substance, watching me. "You were not supposed to remember yet," the voice continued, softer now, almost sad. "Remember what?" I demanded, my fear giving way to frustration. The light pulsed again, and the room seemed to shudder, the walls warping and bending like reflections on water. "Everything," it said, "but not yet." The light faded, and the sphere went dark. The room returned to its stillness, the tension in the air receding like a wave. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the glass, waiting for something else to happen. But the sphere remained lifeless, and the letters didn't reappear. When I left the room, I found the hallway outside had changed. The wallpaper was no longer faded, its colors vibrant and new, and the air smelled of fresh paint and blooming flowers. The house was alive now, its silence no longer oppressive but full of subtle, almost imperceptible sounds. The creak of settling wood, the whisper of wind through unseen cracks. I don't know how long I wandered, or if I was searching for something specific. The rooms I passed were familiar and strange, filled with objects I recognized but couldn't place. A clock that ticked backward, a mirror that reflected a version of me with golden eyes, a music box that played a song I knew but didn't remember learning. Eventually, I found myself outside, standing in the garden I'd seen in the letters, a place that shouldn't exist but felt more real than anything I'd known. The air was warm, the sky an impossible shade of indigo, and the stars above seemed closer than they should be. The glass sphere was still in my hand, though I didn't remember picking it up again. It pulsed faintly, a quiet rhythm that matched my heartbeat. And in that moment, I understood something without knowing why. The house wasn't done with me. Not yet.